From the steppe queen Tomyris, who swore to drench a conquering king in his own blood, to the Blitz mastermind Heinz Guderian, who sent steel columns racing through Europe at dawn, this is a calm yet gripping journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 relaxing hours. We'll begin with how a grieving mother's horse archer trap erased the might of Persia, and move deeper into how crackling radio orders let tanks slice through nations overnight. So put your phone or TV remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Tomyris, Queen of Vengeance. The morning mist clings to the endless grasslands of the Caspian Plains, where the earth seems to breathe in gentle sighs beneath an endless dome of sky. Here, where the world feels both ancient and eternal, the Massagetan herds drift like clouds across the steppe, their bells creating a soft symphony that has echoed unchanged for countless generations. The horizon shimmers with possibility and danger, a place where civilizations meet and clash, where the nomadic way of life stands as a barrier to the ambitions of empires. It is into this vast, quiet world that news arrives of a great king from the south, Cyrus the Great of Persia, whose name has already become whispered legend across the known world. His empire stretches from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of India, and now his hungry gaze turns northward, toward these seemingly endless grasslands, and the fierce tribes who call them home. Among these tribes, the Massagetan stand proud under the rule of Queen Tomyris, a woman whose very name carries the weight of authority across the steppes. But Cyrus, architect of the greatest empire the world has yet known, believes himself master of all he surveys. In his mind, these nomads are merely another obstacle to be overcome, another territory to be absorbed into his vast domain. He does not yet understand that some territories cannot be conquered by conventional means, that some peoples carry within them a different kind of strength entirely. The trap springs with the cruel precision of a master strategist. Cyrus sends word that he wishes to marry Tomyris, to unite their peoples through royal blood. When she refuses this transparent attempt at conquest through marriage, he changes tactics. Instead of the honest clash of armies, he chooses deception. The Persian king stages a false retreat, leaving behind his camp apparently in haste, complete with abundant wine and provisions. But this is no accident of war, it is bait laid with calculated malice. Prince Spargapeses, Tomyris's beloved son and heir to the Massagetan throne, leads a contingent of warriors to investigate the abandoned Persian camp. Young and eager to prove himself, he falls perfectly into Cyrus's snare. The wine flows freely, and the Massagetan warriors, unaccustomed to such strong drink, soon find themselves helpless. When they wake, they are prisoners, and the prince himself is bound in chains before the Persian king. The message that reaches Tomyris carries with it a weight that seems to crush the very air around her. Her son, the light of her life and the future of her people, is held captive by a king who believes he can use love as a weapon. But if Cyrus expects the queen to crumble, to beg for her son's life, to offer her kingdom in exchange for his safety, he has gravely misunderstood the nature of the woman he faces. Instead, Tomyris sends back a message that will echo through history, words carved in ice and delivered with the calm certainty of approaching storm. She demands the immediate release of her son and offers Cyrus safe passage back to his own lands. If he refuses, she promises him something far more precious than victory. She promises him all the blood he could ever desire. The prince, in his captivity, chooses death over dishonor. Unable to bear the shame of being used as a pawn against his mother and his people, Spargapeses takes his own life. When word of this reaches Tomyris, something fundamental shifts in the queen's heart. Where once there might have been room for mercy, now there is only the cold, calculating fury of a mother who has lost everything that matters. The queen's response is swift and terrible in its efficiency. She does not charge blindly into battle, driven by grief and rage. Instead, she becomes something far more dangerous, a strategist whose personal loss has been transformed into perfect, crystalline hatred. She studies her enemy, learns his methods, and prepares to turn his own tactics against him. The battle, when it comes, unfolds like a deadly dance across the steppes. Tomyris appears to retreat, her forces falling back in apparent disarray before the advancing Persian war machine. Cyrus, confident in his superiority, pursues eagerly, his army stretching out in a long column across the grasslands. But this retreat is as false as his own had been, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to draw the Persians deep into terrain of the queen's choosing. As night falls over the steppes, the trap springs closed. The Massagetæ warriors, who had seemed to flee in panic, emerge from concealment on all sides. The Persians find themselves surrounded, caught in the open with nowhere to run. The battle that follows is unlike anything in the civilized world's experience of war. These are not armies meeting in formal combat, but predators and prey in a night-dark killing ground. The Persian campfires, which had burned so confidently at dusk, are extinguished one by one throughout the long night. The sounds of battle drift across the grasslands, the clash of weapons, the cries of men, the thunder of hooves, but by dawn, only silence remains. The greatest army in the world has simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the endless steppes and the fury of a grieving mother. Among the dead lies Cyrus himself, the great king who believed himself invincible, but for Tomyris, his death is not enough. The queen has promised him blood, and she will keep that promise in a way that will haunt the imagination of generations to come. She orders her warriors to bring her the Persian king's head, and when it is placed before her, she produces a wineskin filled with human blood. The image that follows has burned itself into the collective memory of the ancient world. The queen of the Massagetæ, standing amid the wreckage of the Persian army, holds the severed head of the great Cyrus and lowers it into the skin of blood. Her words, as recorded by the historians who would later chronicle this moment, carry with them the weight of perfect justice served cold. "I warned you that I would quench your thirst for blood, and so I shall." This act, terrible and symbolic, sends a message that travels far beyond the steppes. It speaks to every would-be conqueror, every empire builder who believes that all peoples can be subdued, all lands conquered. Some territories, it whispers, come with a price too high to pay. Some enemies are more dangerous in their fury than in their strength. The legacy of Tomyris extends far beyond that single night of vengeance on the Caspian plains. Her name becomes a watchword among the nomadic peoples, a reminder that even the greatest empires can be brought low by those they underestimate. For the civilized world, she represents something more troubling: the idea that beyond the borders of the known world, there are forces that cannot be understood, conquered, or controlled. In the courts of future emperors, the story of Tomyris becomes a cautionary tale. Alexander the Great, centuries later, will remember her example when he chooses not to pursue the Scythians too far into their homeland. Roman generals will think twice before venturing too deep into the Germanic forests. The image of a queen standing over the head of a great king, offering him the blood he so desperately craved, becomes a symbol of the price of hubris. And so the mist continues to rise from the Caspian plains each morning. The herds continue their ancient migrations, and the wind carries with it the memory of a night when the greatest empire in the world learned that some territories are defended not by walls or armies, but by the unbreakable will of those who call them home. Bai Qi, butcher, of Changping. The lamplight flickers against the silk walls of the war tent, casting dancing shadows across the maps spread before the assembled generals. Here, in the heart of the Qin war camp, the air is thick with incense and ambition, where the greatest military minds of the Warring States period gather to plot the future of China. Among them sits a man whose very presence seems to darken the tense atmosphere: Bai Qi, the White Terror, whose name has already become synonymous with victory at any cost. The period known as the Warring States has transformed the Middle Kingdom into a chessboard of competing powers, each seeking to claim the mandate of heaven through conquest. It is an age of innovation and brutality, where military genius walks hand in hand with unprecedented destruction. In this world of endless conflict, Bai Qi has risen to become the most feared general of his generation, a man whose strategic brilliance is matched only by his terrifying willingness to embrace the logic of total war. Born into the minor nobility of Qin, Bai Qi's early life reveals little hint of the monster he would become. Yet from his first military campaigns, something sets him apart from his contemporaries. Where other generals seek glory and honor, Bai Qi pursues something more fundamental: complete annihilation of his enemy's ability to wage war. His methods are calculated, precise, and utterly without mercy. The campaign that will define his legacy begins with a dispute over the strategically vital region of Shandong. The kingdom of Zhao, one of Qin's most powerful rivals, has grown wealthy and confident behind its mountain fortresses. Their armies are numerous, their generals experienced, and their people believe themselves protected by the natural barriers that surround their homeland. They are about to discover that even mountains can become prisons when facing an enemy who understands the true nature of siege warfare. Bai Qi's approach to the Shandong campaign reveals the methodical mind of a master strategist. Rather than launch a direct assault against the Zhao fortifications, he begins with something far more subtle and far more devastating. He cuts the region off from the world. Supply lines that have fed the Zhao armies for generations are severed with surgical precision. Trade routes that have brought prosperity to their cities are closed by carefully positioned forces. Slowly, inexorably, the noose tightens around the throat of Shandong. The siege that follows is not measured in days or weeks, but in years. For 4 long years, Bai Qi maintains his stranglehold on the region, slowly starving his enemies into submission. This is warfare as a test of will, a battle of attrition where victory belongs not to the brave or the skillful, but to the patient and the utterly ruthless. While the Zhao armies wait behind their walls, growing weaker with each passing season, Bai Qi's forces grow stronger, better supplied, and more confident in their ultimate victory. As the 4th year of the siege draws to a close, the Zhao court makes a desperate decision. They gather their remaining strength for one final decisive battle. An army of 400 men, the largest force ever assembled in Chinese history, marches out from the kingdom of Zhao to break the siege of Shandong and destroy the man who has tormented them for so long. This vast host, representing the flower of Zhao's military might, advances with the confidence of overwhelming numbers. But Bai Qi has not spent 4 years in idle waiting. He has used every day of the siege to study the terrain, to understand the patterns of his enemy's movements, to prepare for exactly this moment. The battlefield he has chosen is a masterpiece of military engineering, a series of hills and valleys that will channel the advancing Zhao army into a killing ground of his own design. The Battle of Changping unfolds like a geometric proof written in blood and steel. The massive Zhao army, confident in its numbers, advances into the valley that Bai Qi has prepared for them. The terrain seems to favor the attackers, offering clear ground for their infantry and cavalry to deploy. But this apparent advantage is itself a trap, for the valley is nothing more than a vast funnel designed to compress the enemy force into an ever-narrowing space. As the Zhao vanguard pushes forward, Bai Qi's carefully positioned forces begin their deadly work. From the hills on either side of the valley, Qin archers rain down arrows on the compressed enemy formations. The natural slope of the land prevents the Zhao forces from deploying their full strength, while the narrow confines of the valley make their superior numbers irrelevant. What should have been a decisive charge becomes a slowly tightening trap. The climax of the battle comes when Bai Qi springs his final surprise. Elite Qin forces, hidden in the high ground behind the Zhao army, emerge to block the only route of retreat. The double envelopment is complete. 400 Zhao soldiers find themselves trapped in a valley with no escape, surrounded by enemies who have prepared for this moment for 4 long years. The slaughter that follows is less a battle than an execution. The Zhao forces, packed so tightly they can barely move, become targets for the Qin archers positioned on the surrounding heights. Those who try to flee find their path blocked by fresh enemy troops. Those who try to fight are overwhelmed by the carefully coordinated Qin assault. As the sun sets over the valley of Changping, the greatest army in Chinese history has simply ceased to exist. But for Bai Qi, the battle's end marks only the beginning of the horror. As dawn breaks over the battlefield, the survivors emerge from their hiding places among the corpsesmen too wounded to fight, too frightened to die, too desperate to do anything but surrender. By the customs of war, these men should be treated as prisoners, ransomed back to their families, or pressed into service with the victorious army. Instead, Bai Qi makes a decision that will haunt Chinese history for millennia to come. The order, when it comes, is delivered with the same cold precision that has marked all of Bai Qi's tactical decisions. The prisoners are to be executed not in the heat of battle, not in the fury of victory, but in the calm, calculated manner of administrative policy. The reasoning, as Bai Qi explains to his subordinates, is strategically sound. These men, if released, will only return to fight again. Their deaths will send a message to every potential enemy of Qin resistance is not merely futile, it is fatal. The execution of the Changping prisoners unfolds with the same methodical efficiency that characterized the battle itself. The survivors are organized into groups, led to prepared sites, and killed with the mechanical precision of a state bureaucracy. The number of the dead, some say 400, others claim fewer matters less than the systematic nature of their destruction. This is not the passionate slaughter of a victorious army, but the cold-blooded implementation of a policy designed to terrorize future enemies into submission. The psychological impact of Changping extends far beyond the immediate military consequences. Word of the massacre spreads across the warring kingdoms like wildfire, carrying with it a new understanding of what warfare has become. The old codes of honor, the traditional restraints that had limited the destruction of previous conflicts, have been swept away by the logic of total war. In their place stands a new reality. Defeat is not merely military disaster, but potential extinction. The name of Bai Qi becomes a weapon in itself, a psychological tool as potent as any siege engine or cavalry charge. Enemy armies, facing the prospect of meeting the White Terror in battle, begin to crumble before the fighting even begins. Generals find their own troops deserting rather than face the man who showed no mercy to 400 prisoners. The very mention of his name in enemy councils becomes enough to swing strategic decisions. Yet the shadow of Changping extends beyond even Bai Qi's lifetime. Future Chinese dynasties will invoke his name as both inspiration and warning. Military theorists will study his tactics while philosophers debate the moral implications of his methods. The tension between military effectiveness and human decency, so starkly illustrated at Changping, becomes a recurring theme in Chinese strategic thought. The legacy of the butcher of Changping thus becomes a permanent part of the Chinese military tradition, a reminder that the power to destroy utterly is also the power to corrupt absolutely. In the quiet moments between campaigns, even the most hardened generals would sometimes pause to consider the price of victory and wonder if some triumphs cost more than they could ever be worth. Hannibal, Barca, nightmare of Rome. The Mediterranean dawn breaks across the marble columns of Carthage, where a young boy stands before an altar dedicated to Baal, the ancient god of his people. The child's father, Hamilcar Barca, places a weathered hand upon his son's shoulder as the sacred flames dance before them. Here, in this moment of solemn ritual, 9-year-old Hannibal swears an oath that will shape the destiny of two civilizations. She will never be a friend to Rome. The words, spoken in the ancient Punic tongue, carry with them the weight of ancestral hatred and the promise of vengeance yet to come. 27 years later, that same child, now grown into the most feared military commander of his age, stands at the edge of the known world, gazing up at the snow-capped peaks of the Alps. Behind him stretches an army unlike any the world has ever seen. 90, 0 infantry, 12, 0 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, a multinational force drawn from across the Mediterranean world. Before him lies the path to Rome, a route so treacherous that no army has ever attempted it, so unlikely that the Romans have left it unguarded. The crossing of the Alps unfolds like a nightmare written in ice and stone. For 15 days, Hannibal's army struggles through passes where the mountain winds cut like knives and the snow falls so thick it muffles even the sound of dying. The elephants, magnificent in the warm climate of North Africa, become symbols of suffering in the frozen heights, their trumpeting cries echoing mournfully across the peaks. Men slip from narrow ledges to disappear into chasms whose depths are lost in shadow. The army that emerges into the Italian plains is a fraction of the force that began the journey, but it is tempered by hardship into something harder and more dangerous than mere soldiers. The Romans, secure in their assumption that no enemy could reach them from the north, receive the news of Hannibal's arrival with the stunned disbelief of men whose fundamental understanding of reality has been shattered. Their legions, accustomed to fighting barbarians and city-states, now face an enemy who has already achieved the impossible simply by existing on Italian soil. The psychological impact of Hannibal's presence in Italy cannot be measured in mere military terms. It represents the failure of Roman assumptions about the nature of war itself. The Battle of Cannae stands as perhaps the most perfect tactical victory in military history, a masterpiece of deception and timing that will be studied by generals for thousands of years to come. On the plains of Apulia, Hannibal deploys his polyglot army in a formation that appears to invite destruction. The center of his line, composed of Spanish and Gallic warriors, is deliberately weakened and positioned to bend backward under Roman pressure. To the casual observer, it seems that the Carthaginian general has made a fatal error in deployment. The Roman consul Varro, commanding the largest army Rome has ever put into the field, sees in Hannibal's formation the opportunity for a decisive victory. The legions advance in their traditional formation, a massive rectangular block of disciplined infantry designed to smash through enemy lines by sheer weight and training. For a moment, it seems as though Roman confidence is justified. The Carthaginian center gives ground, bending backward under the pressure of the advancing legions. But this retreat is as carefully choreographed as a religious dance. As the Roman center pushes forward, it becomes compressed, packed more and more tightly together as the Carthaginian line curves inward. The legion's great strength, their disciplined formation, becomes a weakness as they lose the ability to maneuver. And as the Romans commit more and more of their force to exploiting what appears to be a Carthaginian collapse, Hannibal springs his trap. The African infantry, the cream of the Carthaginian army, has been waiting in silence on the wings of the formation. As the Roman center becomes hopelessly entangled in the retreating Gallic and Spanish troops, these elite units wheel inward like the closing of a door. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having driven off the Roman horse, circles around to attack the legions from behind. In the space of a few hours, the hunters have become the hunted. The victors have become the victims. The slaughter at Cannae defies comprehension. Some 70 Romans die in a single afternoon, including the consul Paulus, 80 senators, and thousands of Rome's leading citizens. The survivors carry back to the city tales of horror that beg a belief of Roman eagles trampled in the dust, of legions that simply vanished in the space of an afternoon, of a Carthaginian general who seemed to command the very elements of war itself. Yet, for all its tactical brilliance, Cannae represents only one movement in Hannibal's larger symphony of terror. The Carthaginian general understands that true victory lies not in the destruction of armies, but in the erosion of the enemy's will to continue fighting. His treatment of prisoners becomes part of this psychological campaign. Roman captives are held in chains and darkness, while Allied prisoners are released with gifts and messages of friendship. The intent is clear: to isolate Rome from its allies, to transform the city's strength into weakness. The nights that follow Cannae see strange fires burning in the hills around Rome itself. Hannibal's army, moving with the silent efficiency of a pack of wolves, appears at the gates of the city that once seemed untouchable. The Carthaginian general does not assault the walls she does not need to. His mere presence, the knowledge that the heir of Baal can come and go as he pleases in the heart of Roman territory, is weapon enough. The terror that grips Rome during these dark months is unlike anything in the city's history. Citizens wake each morning wondering if this will be the day the walls are breached, if the nightmare army that has destroyed so many legions will finally claim the city itself. The Senate meets in emergency session after emergency session, but their deliberations have the hollow quality of men who have already accepted their defeat. In the streets, mothers clutch their children closer, and fathers wonder if they will live to see another dawn. Hannibal's intelligence network becomes another weapon in his arsenal of fear. The Carthaginian general seems to know everything: which Roman commanders are competent, which are cowardly, which cities are loyal, which are ready to defect. His spies, drawn from the diverse populations of the Mediterranean, speak every language, worship every god, and carry with them the news that Rome's enemies are everywhere, even within the city itself. The false deserter ploy represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of Hannibal's psychological warfare. Captured Romans, apparently converted to the Carthaginian cause, return to their homeland bearing tales of generous treatment and honorable service under the foreign general. Some of these men are genuine converts, won over by Hannibal's charisma and his promises of a new order in the Mediterranean. Others are plants, sent to spread confusion and defeatism among the Roman population. The result is a climate of suspicion where no one can be trusted completely, where every returned prisoner might be an enemy agent. The slow transformation of Roman society under the pressure of Hannibal's presence reveals the true genius of his strategy. The Romans, a people who had built their identity on military virtue and civic duty, find themselves forced to adopt the tactics of their enemies. They avoid pitched battles, preferring harassment and delay. They employ foreign mercenaries and allied troops rather than relying on their own citizens. Most telling of all, they begin to think like their enemy, to see the world through the eyes of someone who treats war as a contest of wills rather than a clash of armies. The Roman general who finally begins to match Hannibal's methods is Fabius Maximus, dubbed the Delayer by his frustrated contemporaries. Fabius understands that the only way to defeat the master of psychological warfare is to deny him the decisive battles he craves. The Roman strategy becomes one of attrition and patience, wearing down the Carthaginian army through 1,000 small engagements, rather than risking everything on a single throw of the dice. Yet, even as the Romans adapt to meet the challenge, Hannibal's presence continues to warp the fabric of their society. The man who crossed the Alps has become more than a general. He has become a force of nature, a living embodiment of everything the Romans fear about the wider world. His name is spoken in hushed tones in Roman households, used to frighten children into obedience, invoked in prayers as a symbol of divine retribution. The final irony of Hannibal's Italian campaign is that his very success becomes the instrument of his defeat. The Romans, transformed by their encounter with the Master of Terror, emerge from the ordeal as a different people, harder, more ruthless, more willing to employ any means necessary to achieve their ends. The student becomes the teacher, and the methods that Hannibal pioneered in Italy are eventually turned against Carthage itself. When Scipio Africanus finally defeats Hannibal at Zama, he does so using tactics learned from the master himself. The psychological warfare, the intelligence networks, the understanding of war as a contest of wills, all of these become part of the Roman military tradition. The nightmare of Rome has taught the Romans to become the stuff of nightmares themselves, and the Mediterranean world will tremble before their legions for centuries to come. In the end, Hannibal's true victory lies not in the battles he won, but in the transformation he forced upon his enemies. The Rome that emerges from the Second Punic War is no longer the city-state that swore eternal enmity to Carthage. It has become something new, something shaped by its encounter with terror itself, an empire that understands the true nature of power and is willing to use that understanding to reshape the world in its own image. Khalid ibn al-Walid, Sword of God. The desert wind carries the scent of sage and distant rain across the rust-red dunes that surround Medina, where the morning call to prayer echoes from the simple minarets of the Prophet's city. In this landscape of endless horizons and scattered oases, where the line between earth and sky seems to dissolve in the shimmering heat, a transformation is taking place that will reshape the world. The man who once rode against the followers of Muhammad at the Battle of Uhud now kneels in prayer beside them, his conversion from enemy to champion complete, in all but the memories of those who once fled before his cavalry charge. Khalid ibn al-Walid's journey from the fierce warrior of the Meccan nobility to the Sword of God represents one of history's most dramatic personal transformations. Born into the Banu Makhzum clan, he had been raised in the old ways of the Arabian Peninsula, where a man's worth was measured by his skill with sword and spear, his generosity to guests, and his loyalty to tribe and family. His early military prowess had made him a natural leader among the Meccan forces that opposed the spread of Islam, and his tactical brilliance had nearly shattered the Muslim army at Uhud. Yet the very qualities that made him dangerous as an enemy, his keen intelligence, his ability to read the flow of battle, his natural leadership, also made him capable of recognizing truth when he encountered it. The conversion of Khalid represents not merely a change of sides, but a fundamental shift in worldview. As the warrior who had lived for the glory of battle discovered a cause worth fighting for that transcended personal ambition, the Muslim community that welcomed Khalid was unlike any military organization the world had yet seen. Here, tribal distinctions that had divided the Arabian Peninsula for centuries were subsumed into a larger identity based on faith rather than blood. The army that the new convert joined was motivated not by the traditional goals of raid and plunder, but by the revolutionary concept of fighting for the expansion of divine truth. This combination of spiritual motivation and military excellence would prove devastatingly effective against enemies who fought for more conventional reasons. Khalid's first major campaign as a Muslim commander takes him to Mu'tah, where he assumes command of an army already in retreat. The Muslim force, heavily outnumbered by a Byzantine coalition, faces potential annihilation when their original commanders fall in battle. The situation that greets Khalid is every general's nightmare: a demoralized army, superior enemy forces, and a tactical position that offers no obvious route to victory. Yet it is precisely in such moments that true military genius reveals itself. The withdrawal from Mu'tah becomes a masterpiece of tactical maneuvering, as Khalid transforms a potentially catastrophic defeat into something approaching victory. Rather than simply fleeing before the enemy, he conducts a fighting retreat that inflicts maximum casualties while preserving his own force. His use of feigned attacks and false retreats confuses the Byzantine commanders, who cannot determine whether they are pursuing a defeated enemy or walking into a trap. The psychological effect of this uncertainty proves as valuable as any direct military advantage. But it is in the conquest of Iraq that Khalid's reputation as an unstoppable force truly takes shape. The Sassanid Empire, heir to the ancient Persian traditions of Cyrus and Darius, controls the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia through a combination of heavy cavalry, fortified cities, and client Arab tribes. Their military system, refined over centuries of warfare against both Romans and nomads, should be more than adequate to contain the raids of desert Arabs. They are about to discover that they face something entirely different from the traditional tribal warfare of the peninsula. Khalid's approach to the Iraqi campaign reveals the strategic mind of a master. Rather than attempting to storm the Sassanid strongholds directly, he employs a strategy of mobility and deception that keeps his enemies constantly off balance. His forces appear simultaneously at multiple points along the frontier, striking at supply lines, isolated garrisons, and undefended settlements. The speed of his movements makes it impossible for the Sassanid commanders to concentrate their forces effectively, while the psychological impact of his raids spreads panic throughout the province. The Battle of Chains represents the climax of Khalid's Iraqi campaign and perhaps the most brutal demonstration of his tactical genius. The Sassanid general, Hormuz, confident in his superior numbers and heavy cavalry, challenges the Muslim army to a decisive engagement on the plains near Kazima. The resulting battle becomes a demonstration of how mobile tactics can overcome static defense, as Khalid's cavalry executes a series of coordinated attacks that systematically destroy the enemy formation. The name Battle of Chains derives from Khalid's order to bind his warriors together with chains, ensuring that none could flee even if they wished to do so. This dramatic gesture serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates his confidence in victory, it prevents any possibility of retreat, and it sends a powerful psychological message to both his own troops and the enemy. The sight of Muslim warriors literally chained together in their determination to fight to the death creates a terror in the Sassanid ranks that proves as decisive as any tactical maneuver. The conquest of Syria presents Khalid with an entirely different set of challenges. Here, the Byzantine Empire maintains its ancient strength through a network of fortified cities and professional armies. The terrain, with its mixture of mountains, deserts, and fertile valleys, should favor the defensive tactics that have allowed the Byzantines to resist Persian and Arab raids for generations. Yet Khalid's approach to the Syrian campaign demonstrates his ability to adapt his methods to changing circumstances. The march across the Syrian desert to outflank the Byzantine defenses becomes one of the most daring strategic movements in military history. Leading his army through waterless wastes that his enemies consider impassable, Khalid emerges in the rear of the Byzantine positions like a jinn conjured from the desert wind. The psychological impact of this seemingly impossible appearance proves as valuable as the tactical advantage it provides, as Byzantine commanders struggle to understand how an entire army could appear where no army should be able to exist. The Battle of Yarmouk stands as the culmination of Khalid's career and perhaps the most decisive engagement in the history of the early Islamic conquests. Here, on the banks of the Jordan River, the combined forces of the Byzantine Empire make their final stand against the Arab advance. The battle that follows demonstrates every aspect of Khalid's military genius's ability to coordinate complex movements, his understanding of battlefield psychology, and his talent for turning enemy strengths into weaknesses. The sight of Muslim warriors forming prayer circles before the decisive charge at Yarmouk creates one of the most powerful images in the annals of military history. These men, facing the professional soldiers of the Byzantine Empire, take time to perform their religious obligations even as the enemy prepares for battle. The contrast between the spiritual calm of the Muslim ranks and the nervous energy of their opponents serves as a force multiplier that cannot be quantified in terms of numbers or equipment. Yet, for all his tactical brilliance, Khalid's greatest weapon may be his understanding of mercy as an instrument of war. His treatment of defeated enemies and civilian populations establishes a pattern that will characterize the early Islamic conquests. Cities that surrender are treated with remarkable generosity, their inhabitants protected, and their religious practices respected. This policy serves the practical purpose of encouraging surrender, while also demonstrating the moral superiority of the Muslim cause. The psychological impact of Khalid's reputation for both military excellence and merciful treatment creates a unique dynamic in his campaigns. Enemy commanders find themselves facing a general who offers them the choice between honorable surrender and certain destruction. The knowledge that defeat means not massacre and enslavement, but incorporation into a larger and more successful enterprise, undermines the will to resist in ways that pure military might could never achieve. The title, Sayf Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God, captures something essential about Khalid's role in the early Islamic state. He becomes not merely a successful general, but a symbol of divine favor, a living demonstration that the new faith enjoys celestial support. This symbolic dimension of his career proves as important as his tactical victories, as it provides psychological reinforcement for Muslim morale while simultaneously undermining enemy confidence. The final irony of Khalid's career comes with his dismissal by the Caliph Umar, who fears that the Muslim community is becoming too dependent on their great general. The man who never lost a battle is removed from command not because of failure, but because of success too complete to be safely sustained. His quiet acceptance of this decision demonstrates the same wisdom that marked his conversion from enemy to champion, the understanding that individual glory must always be subordinated to the larger cause. In the end, Khalid ibn al-Walid's legacy extends far beyond his battlefield victories. He represents the transformation of Arabian warfare from tribal raiding to imperial conquest, the synthesis of traditional military virtue with revolutionary spiritual motivation. His campaigns establish the tactical and strategic principles that will carry the Islamic conquests from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, while his character demonstrates the possibility of personal transformation in service of a transcendent cause. Attila, the Hun Scourge of God. The vast grasslands of the Hungarian plain stretch endlessly beneath a sky, so wide it seems to curve at the edges, where the sound of wind through the steppe grass mingles with the distant tinkling of bronze bells and the soft murmur of countless horses. Here, in the heart of what the Romans call barbarous wasteland, a different kind of civilization has taken root, based not on cities and walls, but on mobility and the ancient brotherhood of the saddle. It is into this world of felt tents and flickering campfires that embassies from Constantinople and Ravenna venture, their silk robes and golden ornaments seeming strangely fragile against the austere magnificence of the steppe. At the center of this nomadic empire sits a man whose very name has become synonymous with the wrath of heaven itself. Attila, king of the Huns, holds court in a pavilion that rivals any palace in its understated splendor. The tent walls, made of the finest felt and decorated with gold thread, rustle softly in the evening breeze. Inside, the floor is carpeted with the furs of wolves and bears, while bronze braziers cast dancing shadows across the assembled chieftains. The man himself seems almost disappointingly ordinary at first glance of medium height, with the weathered features of one who has spent his life in the saddle, his dark eyes holding an intelligence that seems to peer directly into the souls of those who stand before him. The embassies that approach Attila's court do so with the careful precision of men walking through a den of sleeping lions. These diplomats, representatives of the two halves of the Roman Empire, understand that they stand before perhaps the most dangerous man alive. Yet the nature of that danger is not immediately apparent. Unlike other barbarian kings who rage and bluster, Attila speaks in measured tones, his words carefully chosen, his demands presented with the calm rationality of a merchant discussing trade agreements. This is diplomacy as terror, conducted through the medium of implied threat rather than explicit violence. When Attila mentions the size of his tribute payments from Constantinople, his tone suggests mild disappointment rather than anger. When he discusses the quality of hostages sent by various Gothic tribes, his words carry the weight of experience rather than boastfulness. The ambassadors understand that they are not merely negotiating with a barbarian chieftain, but with the master of a military machine that stretches from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The genius of Attila's diplomatic approach lies in his understanding that the mere possibility of war can be more effective than war itself. The golden arm rings that adorn his wrists, gifts from emperors who would rather pay than fight, serve as visible reminders of his power. The exotic furs that cover his pavilion floor, tribute from northern tribes who have learned the cost of resistance, speak to the reach of his authority. Every detail of his court is calculated to reinforce the message that cooperation brings rewards, while defiance brings destruction. The transformation of the Hun Confederation under Attila's leadership represents one of history's most remarkable examples of personal charisma translating into political power. The tribes that follow him have traditionally been raiders and herders, their loyalties shifting with the seasons and the availability of plunder. Yet, under Attila's leadership, they have become something unprecedented, a unified nomadic empire capable of challenging the greatest powers of the civilized world. The secret of this transformation lies not merely in Attila's military prowess, but in his understanding of the psychological foundations of leadership. He positions himself not as a conqueror seeking personal glory, but as the instrument of divine will, the earthly representative of the sky god worshipped by the steppe peoples. This religious dimension of his authority provides a source of legitimacy that transcends tribal boundaries and personal ambitions. The winter crossing of the Rhine represents the moment when Attila's reputation transforms from regional threat to existential nightmare for the Western Roman Empire. The frozen river, traditionally an impassable barrier that has protected Gaul from barbarian invasion, becomes merely another road for the Hun cavalry. The image of endless columns of horsemen crossing the ice under the pale winter sun creates a terror that spreads faster than the riders themselves. The cities of Gaul receive word of Attila's approach, with the stunned disbelief of people whose fundamental assumptions about safety have been shattered. Metz, Reims, and dozens of other settlements empty themselves as their populations flee westward, carrying with them tales of the approaching storm. The very name of Attila becomes a weapon that clears roads and empties strongholds without the need for siege engines or assault troops. Yet for all the terror he inspires, Attila's actual conduct of warfare reveals a strategic mind of remarkable sophistication. Rather than simply destroying everything in his path, he employs terror as a precision instrument, carefully calibrated to achieve specific political objectives. Cities that surrender immediately are often spared significant damage, their populations treated with surprising clemency. Those that resist face destruction so complete that their fate serves as an object lesson for others. The psychological dimension of Attila's military campaigns extends beyond the immediate battlefield to encompass the broader political landscape of the dying Western Empire. His very presence in Gaul forces uncomfortable questions about Roman legitimacy and effectiveness. If the empire cannot protect its own cities from barbarian invasion, what justification does it have for demanding loyalty and tribute from its subjects? The Battle of the Catalonian Plains represents both the climax of Attila's power and the moment when his limitations become apparent. Here, on the fields of Champagne, the largest armies ever assembled in Western Europe meet in a struggle that will determine the future of the continent. The Roman general Aetius, commanding a coalition of Visigoths, Franks, and Imperial troops, faces the united strength of the Hun Confederation and its Germanic allies. The battle itself unfolds with a terrible grandeur that witnesses will remember for the rest of their lives. The clash of cavalry charges echoes across the plain like thunder, while the air grows thick with dust and the cries of men and horses. For hours, the outcome hangs in balance, as the disciplined Roman infantry faces the mobility of the Hun cavalry. The death of the Visigothic king Theodoric in the fighting adds a note of tragic heroism to the day's events, while Attila's own presence in the thick of the combat demonstrates the personal courage that has made him a legend among his followers. Yet despite his tactical skill and personal bravery, Attila cannot quite achieve the decisive victory that would have opened the road to Rome itself. The withdrawal of his forces from the battlefield, conducted with the same precision that marked his approach, represents not defeat but strategic calculation. The king of the Huns understands that discretion can be as valuable as valor, that a leader who lives to fight another day is more useful than a dead hero. The aftermath of the Catalonian plains reveals another dimension of Attila's genius, ability to transform strategic disappointment into psychological victory. The very fact that he was able to penetrate so deeply into Roman territory to challenge the empire's greatest general on his own chosen ground serves to enhance rather than diminish his reputation. The withdrawal becomes not a retreat, but a demonstration of his ability to strike anywhere, anytime, and to withdraw safely when conditions are not favorable. The invasion of Italy that follows represents Attila at the height of his power and confidence. The Alpine passes that have protected the peninsula for centuries prove no barrier to his cavalry, while the cities of the Po Valley empty themselves before his advance. Milan falls without significant resistance, its population fleeing southward with tales of the approaching apocalypse. The road to Rome itself lies open, defended only by armies that have already proven their inadequacy against Hun tactics. Yet it is at this moment of apparent triumph that the most mysterious episode of Attila's career unfolds. The meeting between the King of the Huns and Pope Leo I, conducted in the open air near the banks of the Mincio River, results in Attila's unexpected decision to withdraw from Italy entirely. The precise nature of their conversation remains unknown, lost to history like so many details of this enigmatic man's life. Some chroniclers suggest that the Pope's eloquence and moral authority convinced Attila to spare the Eternal City. Others propose more practical explanations: disease in the Hun army, supply difficulties, or reports of Eastern Roman forces threatening his base territories. The truth, like so much about Attila, remains shrouded in the mists of time and legend. What cannot be disputed is the lasting impact of these campaigns on the collective memory of Europe. The name of Attila becomes embedded in the folklore of every nation he touched, transformed by medieval chroniclers and storytellers into something more than human. He becomes the Scourge of God, the divine instrument sent to punish Christian Europe for its sins, a figure who transcends mere military history to become part of the mythological landscape of the continent. This transformation from historical figure to legendary monster reveals something important about the nature of Attila's achievement. His true victory lay not in the cities he captured or the armies he defeated, but in his ability to implant himself so deeply in the European imagination that his name would be whispered around winter fires for centuries to come. The terror he inspired outlived his physical presence, becoming a permanent part of the cultural DNA of the civilizations he challenged. The death of Attila, occurring quietly in his bed during his wedding feast, provides a fitting end to a career built on the unexpected and the dramatic. The man who had terrorized two empires dies not in battle but in the most peaceful of circumstances, leaving behind a legacy that would far outlive his fragmented empire. His sons, lacking his genius for leadership and psychological manipulation, quickly see their inheritance dissolve into competing factions and forgotten kingdoms. Yet the legend of Attila proves more durable than any political structure. Medieval chroniclers, seeking to understand the collapse of the classical world, find in his career a convenient explanation for the end of the old order. The Scourge of God becomes both symptom and cause of the transformation that turned the ancient world into something new and strange. In the long twilight of the Western Empire, his shadow looms large over the imagination of those trying to make sense of their changing world. Genghis Khan, Lord of Horsemen. The wind moves across the grasslands of the Onon River Valley with the sigh of eternity itself, carrying with it the scent of wild grass and distant storms. Here, beneath the endless dome of the Mongolian sky, where earth and heaven seem to meet in an embrace that has endured since the beginning of time, a boy named Temujin learns the harsh lessons that will shape him into the most feared conqueror in human history. The land itself seems to breathe with ancient wisdom, its vast emptiness teaching patience, endurance, and the understanding that survival depends on strength, cunning, and the ability to read the subtle signs that mean the difference between life and death. The early years of the future Genghis Khan unfold like a cautionary tale written in blood and betrayal. Born into a world where tribal alliances shift, like the patterns of clouds across the steppe, young Temujin experiences the full brutality of nomadic life. His father Yesugei's death by poison, orchestrated by rival Tatars, leaves the boy's family vulnerable to the predatory ambitions of former allies. The Taichud tribe, once bound to his father by oaths of brotherhood, seizes the opportunity to eliminate potential threats, taking the 9-year-old Temujin prisoner and forcing him to endure months of captivity that would break a lesser spirit. The wooden collar locked around the boy's neck serves as more than mere restraint. It becomes a symbol of the humiliation that awaits those without power in the unforgiving world of the steppes. Yet even in captivity, Temujin displays the intelligence and determination that will later terrify continents. His escape, accomplished through a combination of patience, planning, and the assistance of a sympathetic guard, provides the first glimpse of the strategic mind that will one day coordinate the movements of armies across thousands of miles. The transformation of Temujin from fugitive outcast to supreme ruler of the Mongol tribes reveals the emergence of a new kind of leadership on the steppes. Traditional nomadic authority had been based on birth, wealth, and the shifting loyalties of clan relationships. Temujin, lacking all of these advantages, is forced to build his power on something more fundamental: personal charisma, military genius, and an innovative approach to tribal politics that transcends traditional boundaries. The key to his success lies in his understanding that the old ways of steppe warfare, based on raiding and personal vendetta, are inadequate for the challenges of the changing world. As Chinese empires grow stronger and more unified, as trade routes become more important, as the settled peoples develop new technologies and tactics, the fragmented tribes of Mongolia face extinction unless they can adapt. Temujin's genius lies in recognizing this necessity and having the vision to imagine a different kind of nomadic society. The codification of the Yasa, the great law code that will govern the Mongol Empire, represents perhaps Temujin's most lasting achievement. This systematic approach to governance transforms the chaotic tribal relationships of the steppes into something resembling a modern state. The laws themselves reflect the harsh realities of nomadic life: death for stealing horses, severe punishment for adultery, absolute loyalty demanded to the Khan above all tribal affiliations. Yet they also contain provisions that seem remarkably progressive for their time: religious tolerance, meritocratic promotion, protection for ambassadors and merchants. The psychological impact of the Yasa extends far beyond its specific provisions. For the first time in steppe history, there exists a unified legal framework that applies to all tribes, all ranks, all situations. The arbitrary nature of traditional tribal justice, where disputes were settled by strength and cunning, gives way to a system where even the humblest herder can appeal to established precedent. This transformation of Mongol society from chaos to order provides the foundation for everything that follows. The military innovations that emerge under Temujin's leadership represent a revolution in the art of war that will terrorize the civilized world. The traditional strengths of steppe warriors' mobility, archery skills, hardiness are systematized and enhanced through rigorous training and organization. The decimal system of military organization, with units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, allows for coordination on a scale previously impossible among nomadic forces. But the true genius of Mongol military doctrine lies not in its organization, but in its flexibility and adaptability. Unlike the rigid formations favored by settled armies, Mongol tactics emphasize deception, surprise, and the psychological destruction of enemy morale. The feigned retreat, perfected over generations of steppe warfare, becomes an art form in Mongol hands. Enemy commanders, convinced they are pursuing a defeated foe, find themselves drawn into carefully prepared killing zones where the hunters become the hunted. The siege of Beijing represents the moment when the world realizes that something unprecedented has emerged from the steppes. Traditional nomadic armies had always been frustrated by fortified cities, lacking both the technology and the patience for prolonged sieges. Yet the Mongols who appear before the walls of the Jin capital demonstrate capabilities that seem to transcend the limitations of their nomadic heritage. The secret lies in Temujin's willingness to learn from his enemies and to incorporate their knowledge into his own military system. Chinese engineers, captured in earlier campaigns, find themselves compelled to serve their conquerors by constructing siege engines of unprecedented size and effectiveness. The great city walls that have protected Beijing for centuries prove inadequate against weapons designed by the city's own former defenders. Yet the true horror of the Beijing siege lies not in its technical innovations, but in its psychological dimensions. The Mongol army surrounding the city is unlike any nomadic force in history. It is a disciplined, organized, and apparently inexhaustible war machine that shows no signs of giving up or going away. The defenders, accustomed to dealing with raiders who strike quickly and withdraw, find themselves facing an enemy that seems prepared to sit outside their walls forever. The composite bow becomes the symbol of Mongol military superiority, a weapon that embodies both the traditional skills of the steppe warrior and the innovative spirit of the new empire. Capable of penetrating armor at ranges that seem impossible to settled peoples, the Mongol bow transforms mounted archery into a devastating tactical system. The sight of thousands of horsemen releasing coordinated volleys creates a terror that transcends mere military effectiveness. It represents the transformation of hunting skills into instruments of apocalyptic destruction. The thunderous sound of Mongol kettle drums echoing across the battlefield serves purposes beyond mere communication. These massive instruments, capable of being heard for miles, create a psychological atmosphere that unnerves enemy forces before the fighting even begins. The deep, rhythmic pounding seems to emanate from the earth itself, suggesting vast, invisible forces preparing to emerge from beyond the horizon. The treatment of conquered populations reveals another dimension of Mongol psychological warfare. The empire's policy toward defeated enemies follows a stark, logic-complete submission, brings incorporation into the Mongol system, with its attendant benefits, while resistance results in destruction so complete that it serves as an example to others. This calculated use of mercy and brutality creates a climate where surrender becomes the rational choice for any leader who values the survival of his people. The sparing of artisans, scholars, and skilled craftsmen during Mongol conquests demonstrates the empire's sophisticated understanding of the sources of real wealth and power. While common soldiers and administrators are often slaughtered without mercy, those who possess useful knowledge find themselves transported across the empire to serve their new masters. This selective preservation of human resources allows the Mongols to rapidly absorb and utilize the technological and cultural achievements of their victims. The message system that emerges to serve the expanding empire represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Mongol administration. The Yam, a network of relay stations stretching from Korea to Hungary, enables communication across the largest land empire in human history, at speeds that seem almost magical to contemporary observers. Imperial messengers, changing horses at regular intervals, can carry orders from Karakoram to distant frontiers in a matter of days, allowing for coordination of military operations on a continental scale. The intelligence network that supports these communications creates a climate of terror among potential enemies who discover that the Mongols seem to know everything about their plans, their resources, and their vulnerabilities. Local populations, conscripted into service as guides and informants, provide detailed knowledge of terrain, weather patterns, and political relationships that would take conventional armies years to acquire. The conquest of Khwarezm represents the full flowering of Mongol military genius, a campaign that demonstrates their ability to operate effectively in every type of terrain and against every variety of enemy. The Persian Empire that faces the Mongol invasion is among the most sophisticated military powers of its age, possessing strong fortifications, numerous cavalry, and experienced commanders. Yet the systematic destruction of Khwarezmian resistance reveals the extent to which Mongol capabilities exceed those of their opponents. The siege of Samarkand becomes a masterpiece of psychological warfare, as the Mongols demonstrate their ability to capture even the strongest fortifications through a combination of technical innovation and terror. The use of captured Khwarezmian soldiers as human shields during the assault creates a moral dilemma for the defenders that proves as effective as any siege engine. The fall of the city, followed by the systematic massacre of its population, sends a message that resonates throughout the Islamic world. The pursuit of the fleeing Khwarezm Shah across the breadth of Asia demonstrates another dimension of Mongol operational capability. Traditional armies, tied to established supply lines and seasonal campaigning patterns, would have abandoned such a chase as impractical. Yet Mongol forces, living off the land and maintaining their mobility through superior logistics, are able to sustain pursuit across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The death of Genghis Khan, occurring during the siege of the Tangut capital, marks the end of an era but not the end of the terror his name inspires. The secret burial, conducted according to ancient Mongol traditions in an unmarked grave somewhere on the steppes, ensures that the location of his remains becomes one of history's greatest mysteries. Yet this secrecy serves to enhance, rather than diminish, his legendary status, as the absence of a known tomb allows the imagination to place him everywhere and nowhere. The division of the empire among his sons and grandsons creates multiple centers of Mongol power that will continue to terrorize different regions of the world for generations to come. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia all carry forward different aspects of the Mongol military and administrative tradition. The lasting impact of the Mongol conquests extends far beyond their immediate military achievements. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and stability that follows the initial wave of conquest, creates conditions for unprecedented cultural and commercial exchange across Eurasia. The merchants, monks, and mapmakers who travel the protected trade routes of the empire carry with them not only goods and ideas, but also stories and memories of the terror that made such peaceful exchange possible. The transformation of Genghis Khan from historical figure to mythological force represents one of the most remarkable examples of posthumous reputation building in human history. The man who began life as an outcast prisoner becomes, in the collective memory of Eurasia, something approaching a force of nature, the embodiment of destruction and change, the symbol of the price that settled civilizations pay for complacency and weakness. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Genghis Khan's legacy lies not in the cities he destroyed or the armies he defeated, but in his demonstration that the world is never as stable or secure as it appears. The grasslands that stretch endlessly beyond the horizon always harbor the possibility of change, the potential for new forms of organization and new sources of power that can transform the established order in ways that seem impossible until they happen. Subutai hammer of the steppe. In the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, where a single military campaign might span continents and a general's orders could set in motion events thousands of miles apart, there emerged a figure whose strategic genius would prove as frightening to his enemies as the thunderous charge of 10,000 horsemen. Subutai, whose very name would become synonymous with the impossible made real, possessed a mind capable of thinking on a scale that dwarfed the comprehension of his contemporaries. While other commanders planned battles, Subutai orchestrated symphonies of destruction that played out across multiple theaters simultaneously, their various movements converging with the precision of celestial mechanics. The concept of coordinating military operations across vast distances was not merely a tactical innovation, it represented a fundamental revolution in the nature of warfare itself. Traditional military thinking had been constrained by the limitations of communication and supply, forcing commanders to concentrate their forces in single locations and fight decisive battles within relatively small geographic areas. Subutai's genius lay in his understanding that these limitations could be transcended through superior organization, intelligence gathering, and the systematic exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire provides the first glimpse of Subutai's extraordinary capabilities. While Genghis Khan and Jochi prosecute the main assault against the empire's heartland, Subutai leads a separate force in pursuit of the fleeing Shah. This is not merely a matter of dividing forces for greater efficiency, represents a carefully calculated strategy designed to prevent the enemy from regrouping while simultaneously gathering intelligence about territories that might become future targets of Mongol expansion. The pursuit of the Khwarezm Shah takes Subutai's forces through some of the most challenging terrain in the known world. From the deserts of Khorasan to the mountains of the Caucasus, across the steppes of southern Russia, and into the forests of Georgia, the Mongol general demonstrates an ability to operate effectively in environments that would challenge the most experienced commanders. Yet this is more than mere adaptability. It represents a systematic approach to warfare that treats the entire Earth as a potential battlefield. The intelligence network that supports these far-ranging operations reveals another dimension of Subutai's genius. Long before his armies appear on distant horizons, his agents have already mapped the political landscape, identified potential allies and enemies, and gathered detailed information about terrain, climate, and resources. The Mongol forces that emerge from the Caucasus, passes to surprise the princes of Kiev, possess a knowledge of local conditions that rivals that of native inhabitants. The Battle of the Khalkha River stands as perhaps the most perfect example of Subutai's tactical brilliance and psychological understanding. The Russian princes who march to meet what they assume is a conventional nomadic raiding force find themselves facing something entirely different, a coordinated military operation that has been planned with the precision of a mathematical proof. The Mongol forces that appear before them represent only the visible portion of a much larger strategic design. The preliminary skirmishing that precedes the main battle serves multiple purposes beyond the obvious tactical advantages. By engaging the Russian forces in a series of minor clashes, Subutai's commanders gather detailed information about enemy capabilities, leadership, and morale. More importantly, these encounters serve to draw the Russian forces further from their supply bases and deeper into terrain of the Mongols' choosing. The feigned retreat that characterizes the early phases of the battle represents the refinement of traditional steppe tactics to a level approaching art. The Mongol withdrawal appears so genuine, so complete, that even experienced Russian commanders become convinced they are pursuing a defeated enemy. The psychological effect of this apparent victory creates a dangerous overconfidence that blinds the pursuers to the trap being prepared for them. The river crossing that gives the battle its name becomes the focal point of Subutai's tactical masterpiece. The Russian forces, strung out in pursuit formation and focused on their quarry, fail to notice the systematic positioning of Mongol units on both sides of their line of advance. When the trap springs, the hunters find themselves surrounded by enemies who seem to have emerged from the earth itself. The slaughter that follows serves purposes beyond mere military victory. The systematic destruction of the Russian army, conducted with the methodical efficiency that characterizes all Mongol operations, sends a message that resonates throughout the Orthodox world. The princes who die on the banks of the Khalkha River represent centuries of accumulated military experience and political authority, their deaths creating a power vacuum that will take generations to fill. Yet perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Khalkha River campaign is its casual nature. For Subutai, the destruction of the largest army in Russian history represents nothing more than a reconnaissance in force, a preliminary operation designed to gather information for future campaigns. The ease with which he accomplishes this devastating victory suggests capabilities that dwarf anything previously seen in European warfare. The withdrawal of Mongol forces following their victory creates almost as much terror as the battle itself. The Russian survivors, expecting the nomadic armies to exploit their success by moving immediately against the major cities of the region, instead watch in bewilderment as the Mongols simply disappear back into the steppes. This restraint, so contrary to the expectations of contemporary warfare, suggests a level of strategic planning that transcends immediate tactical advantage. The European campaign that follows, more than a decade later, demonstrates how the intelligence gathered during the Khalkha River expedition has been transformed into a comprehensive plan for continental conquest. The Mongol armies that cross the Carpathians into Hungary and Poland do so with detailed knowledge of political relationships, military capabilities, and geographic features that could only have been acquired through years of systematic preparation. The coordination of operations in this campaign exceeds anything previously attempted in the history of warfare. While Batu Khan leads the main force against Hungary, Subutai coordinates a simultaneous invasion of Poland designed to prevent potential reinforcement of Hungarian resistance. The timing of these operations, separated by hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, demonstrates a level of strategic planning that seems almost supernatural to contemporary observers. The Battle of Legnica unfolds like a precisely orchestrated demonstration of Mongol military superiority. The Polish and German knights who charge the Mongol formations do so with the confidence born of centuries of success against traditional nomadic tactics. They discover too late that they face something entirely different, a military system that has absorbed and improved upon the best practices of every army it has encountered. The use of smokescreens and coordinated missile fire during the battle reveals the extent to which Mongol tactics have evolved beyond their steppe origins. These are not merely skilled horsemen relying on traditional weapons, but professional soldiers employing sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrate cavalry, infantry, and siege engines into a seamless whole. The European heavy cavalry, masters of the medieval battlefield, find themselves as helpless as children against this new form of warfare. The Battle of Mohi, fought within days of the Polish victory, demonstrates Subutai's ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances while maintaining tactical flexibility on individual battlefields. The Hungarian army that faces the Mongols represents the largest and most experienced force in Central Europe, led by King Bela IV and supported by contingents from across the Holy Roman Empire. The river crossing that begins the battle showcases Mongol engineering capabilities that surprise and terrify their European opponents. The speed with which the nomadic armies construct bridges and coordinate amphibious operations suggests a level of technical sophistication that contradicts every assumption about barbarian limitations. The Hungarian forces, confident in the protection offered by the Danube, find their defensive positions outflanked with an efficiency that seems impossible. The psychological impact of simultaneous Mongol victories at Legnica and Mohi cannot be overstated. European chroniclers, struggling to understand how nomadic armies could achieve such devastating success against the flower of Christian knighthood, begin to describe the Mongols in terms borrowed from biblical apocalypse. The idea that the end times have arrived becomes a serious topic of theological discussion in monasteries across the continent. The logistics system that supports these far-ranging operations represents perhaps Subutai's most remarkable achievement. The ability to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles of hostile territory, to coordinate the movements of multiple armies operating independently, and to ensure communication between widely separated commanders requires organizational capabilities that exceed those of contemporary settled states. The relay system of messengers that connects Subutai's various commands with the imperial capital at Karakorum operates with a precision that astounds foreign observers. Orders issued by the Great Khan can reach field commanders in Eastern Europe within a matter of days, while intelligence gathered on distant battlefields flows back to central headquarters with similar efficiency. This communications network transforms the Mongol Empire into something resembling a modern military organization. The intelligence-gathering capabilities that support Mongol operations go far beyond simple reconnaissance. Subutai's forces seem to possess detailed knowledge of enemy political relationships, economic resources, and military capabilities long before any direct contact occurs. European commanders find themselves facing an enemy who knows their strengths and weaknesses better than they know themselves. The use of psychological warfare as a force multiplier demonstrates another dimension of Subutai's genius. The systematic use of terror, the deliberate creation of refugee flows that strain enemy resources, and the careful manipulation of information create conditions where actual military operations achieve maximum effect with minimum expenditure of resources. The reputation of Mongol invincibility becomes a weapon as potent as any physical force. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Subutai's character is his personal humility and apparent indifference to personal glory. Unlike many great commanders whose egos demand public recognition, Subutai seems genuinely content to remain in the shadows, allowing others to receive credit for victories he has orchestrated. This selflessness, so contrary to the expectations of military leadership, suggests a level of confidence and security that transcends normal human motivations. The withdrawal of Mongol forces from Europe following the death of Ögedei Khan demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of the empire's command structure. Subutai's armies, poised to continue their westward advance toward the Atlantic, instead turn back toward Mongolia to participate in the selection of a new great Khan. This adherence to legal and customary procedures, even at the cost of strategic opportunity, reveals the disciplined nature of Mongol leadership. The legacy of Subutai's campaigns extends far beyond their immediate military consequences. The demonstration that coordinated operations could be conducted across continental distances, that communication and supply systems could be maintained over vast geographic areas, and that intelligence gathering could provide detailed knowledge of distant territories, establishes principles that will influence military thinking for centuries to come. In the end, Subutai represents something more frightening than a successful general. He embodies the possibility of strategic thinking on a scale that transcends traditional limitations. His campaigns demonstrate that the world is smaller and more connected than it appears, that events in one region can be systematically coordinated with developments thousands of miles away, and that the patient application of organizational genius can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Timur Pyramid of Skulls. The evening sun sets fire to the turquoise domes and golden minarets of Samarkand, where the air itself seems to shimmer with the dreams and ambitions of a man who would remake the world in his own terrible image. Here, in the heart of what was once Alexander's Eastern Empire, where the ancient Silk Road brings together the treasures and wisdom of 3 continents, a different kind of ruler holds court. The throne room of Timur the Lame, known to his enemies as Tamerlane, echoes with the soft whispers of astronomers and soothsayers who seek to read the future in the movements of stars and the flight patterns of birds. The man who sits upon the ivory throne is himself a study in contradictions that seem to embody the complex nature of his age. Physically diminished by the wounds that gave him his epithet, intellectually towering over the scholars and generals who surround him, Timur represents the synthesis of nomadic warrior culture with the sophisticated administrative traditions of settled civilization. His court combines the mobility and martial prowess of the steppes with the artistic refinement and technological innovation of the great urban centers he has conquered. The astrologers who attend Timur's every decision represent more than mere superstition. They embody his understanding that psychological warfare extends beyond the immediate battlefield to encompass the realm of the supernatural and the divine. By positioning himself as the agent of celestial will, the earthly instrument of cosmic justice, Timur transforms his military campaigns from mere exercises in conquest into religious crusades blessed by heaven itself. The terror he inspires thus acquires a metaphysical dimension that transcends simple fear of physical destruction. The siegecraft innovations that emerge under Timur's patronage represent a revolution in the art of urban warfare that will terrorize the fortified cities of 3 continents. The traditional limitations that had protected walled settlements from nomadic armies, the need for specialized equipment, the requirement for sustained logistics, the necessity of technical expertise, systematically overcome through the ruthless exploitation of captured knowledge and forced cooperation. The engineers who serve in Timur's armies do so not through choice but through the compelling logic of survival. Captured during the conquest of their home cities, these men find themselves compelled to turn their skills against other centers of resistance. The siege engines they construct under Mongol supervision represent the marriage of Eastern mobility with Western technical sophistication, creating weapons systems that exceed the capabilities of either tradition operating independently. The psychological impact of these hybrid weapons extends far beyond their immediate tactical effectiveness. The sight of nomadic armies deploying siege engines designed by the enemy's own countrymen creates a terror that undermines the fundamental assumptions upon which urban defense has been based. If the knowledge that protects cities can be turned against them, if the very expertise that creates walls can be forced to breach them, then what security can any fortress offer against a sufficiently determined attacker? The siege of Baghdad represents perhaps the most devastating demonstration of Timur's systematic approach to urban warfare. The ancient capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, heir to centuries of accumulated wisdom and wealth, falls to tactics that combine traditional Mongol mobility with captured Islamic engineering knowledge. The flooding of the city's defensive works, accomplished through the systematic diversion of the Tigris River, demonstrates capabilities that seem to transcend the normal limitations of nomadic warfare. The psychological broadcasts that precede Timur's assaults represent another innovation in the art of terror. Unlike traditional siege warfare, which relied primarily on physical force to breach defenses, Timur's campaigns employ systematic propaganda designed to undermine enemy morale before the fighting begins. Messages promising mercy to those who surrender immediately are followed by detailed descriptions of the fate awaiting those who resist, creating a climate where capitulation becomes the rational choice for any leader who values the survival of his people. Yet the most chilling aspect of these psychological campaigns is their deliberate inconsistency. Cities that surrender in the expectation of mercy sometimes find themselves subjected to the same systematic destruction as those that resisted to the end. This calculated unpredictability serves to enhance rather than diminish the terror associated with Timur's name, as potential victims discover that neither submission nor resistance guarantees survival. The construction of skull pyramids that gives this period of Timur's career its grisly epithet represents the systematization of terror as an instrument of state policy. These monuments to destruction, built from the remains of conquered populations, serve multiple purposes beyond their obvious function as warnings to potential resistors. They provide visible proof of Timur's power, demonstrate the fate awaiting his enemies, and create lasting memorials that will continue to inspire fear long after his armies have moved on to other targets. The precise engineering that goes into the construction of these macabre monuments reveals the same attention to detail that characterizes Timur's military operations. The skulls are arranged not randomly, but according to geometric principles that maximize both structural stability and visual impact. The resulting pyramids become architectural achievements in their own right, terrible testaments to the marriage of artistic sensibility with ruthless pragmatism. The psychological impact of these monuments extends far beyond their immediate localities. Merchants traveling the trade routes, pilgrims journeying to holy sites, and diplomats carrying messages between courts all encounter these silent testimonies to Timur's power. The stories they carry back to their home cities create a climate of terror that often proves more effective than actual military conquest in securing submission. The career of detours that characterizes Timur's later campaigns demonstrates his understanding that power must be constantly demonstrated to remain effective. Rather than simply consolidating his conquests and ruling from a fixed capital, he maintains the nomadic tradition of constant movement, appearing unexpectedly at distant frontiers to remind potential enemies of his continuing vitality. These campaigns serve the dual purpose of gathering plunder and intelligence while maintaining the psychological pressure that keeps his vast empire intact. The invasion of India represents one of the most audacious demonstrations of Timur's strategic vision. The subcontinent, protected by geography and defended by numerous powerful sultanates, had traditionally been beyond the reach of Central Asian conquerors. Yet Timur's forces crossed the Hindu Kush with the same methodical efficiency that characterized their European campaigns, appearing before the walls of Delhi like a manifestation of divine wrath. The sack of Delhi showcases all the innovations in siege warfare and psychological manipulation that Timur has perfected over decades of campaigning. The city's defenders, confident in their numerical superiority and defensive preparations, discover that they face something unprecedented: a military organization capable of sustaining complex operations thousands of miles from its base, employing tactics and technologies drawn from across the known world. The systematic exploitation of captured Indian artisans and scholars demonstrates another dimension of Timur's strategic thinking. Rather than simply destroying the cultural achievements of his victims, he absorbs their knowledge and skills into his own expanding empire. The craftsmen who built Delhi's magnificent mosques find themselves transported to Samarkand to create even grander monuments to their conqueror's glory. The Turkish campaign that follows represents Timur's most ambitious undertaking, a direct challenge to the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. The Battle of Ankara, where he defeats and captures Sultan Bayezid I, sends shockwaves throughout both the Islamic and Christian worlds. The sight of the Ottoman Sultan in chains, displayed like a trophy in Timur's baggage train, undermines assumptions about Turkish invincibility that had dominated European strategic thinking for generations. The global ripple effects of Timur's campaigns extend far beyond their immediate geographic scope. The disruption of trade routes, the destruction of urban centers, and the massive population movements triggered by his conquests create economic and social dislocations that affect regions he never directly attacked. European merchants find their eastern trade disrupted, Chinese administrators must deal with refugee flows from Central Asia, and Indian rulers discover that traditional alliances and enmities have been rendered obsolete by the emergence of this new power. The diplomatic correspondence that survives from Timur's court reveals the global nature of his ambitions and the systematic approach he brings to international relations. Letters to European monarchs, Chinese emperors, and Indian sultans demonstrate his understanding that modern warfare requires not merely military excellence, but sophisticated intelligence gathering and psychological manipulation conducted on a continental scale. The intelligence network that supports these far-ranging diplomatic and military operations represents perhaps Timur's most remarkable organizational achievement. Information flows from the courts of distant enemies, from merchant caravans crossing remote trade routes, and from religious communities scattered across 3 continents, providing him with knowledge that enables him to strike at the precise moment when his enemies are most vulnerable. The architectural projects that Timur sponsors in Samarkand during the brief interludes between campaigns reveal another dimension of his complex character. The same man who orders the construction of skull pyramids also patronizes some of the most beautiful buildings in Islamic architecture. The madrasas, mosques, and mausoleums that rise in his capital represent an attempt to balance the destruction he has wrought with creation of lasting beauty. This apparent contradiction between the destroyer and the builder reflects the complex nature of Timur's historical legacy. Unlike purely destructive conquerors whose impact is measured solely in terms of what they destroy, Timur's conquests create the conditions for new forms of cultural synthesis and artistic achievement. The artisans and scholars he transports from conquered cities contribute to a cosmopolitan culture in Samarkand that represents the best achievements of multiple civilizations. The patronage of learning that characterizes Timur's court demonstrates his understanding that lasting power requires more than military success. The historians, poets, and theologians who gather in Samarkand create a narrative framework that justifies his conquests in terms of divine will and historical necessity. These intellectual achievements provide a foundation for legitimacy that transcends mere military accomplishment. The library that Timur establishes in Samarkand, filled with manuscripts looted from the greatest centers of learning in the Islamic world, represents both the destructive and preservative aspects of his career. Books that might have been lost forever in the ruins of Baghdad or Delhi find new homes in his capital, ensuring their survival for future generations while simultaneously serving as trophies of his conquests. The death of Timur during his planned invasion of China marks the end of an era, but not the end of his influence on world history. The empire he created, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, fragments immediately upon his death. Yet the cultural and political changes he set in motion continue to reverberate across the Islamic world for centuries. The Timurid Renaissance that follows his death represents perhaps the most positive aspect of his legacy. His descendants, particularly Ulu Beg and Babur, combine the military traditions he established with renewed emphasis on learning and cultural achievement. The astronomical observations conducted in Samarkand, the literary achievements of the Timurid courts, and the architectural innovations of the period all bear witness to the creative potential that can emerge from the synthesis of diverse cultural traditions. Yet the darker aspects of Timur's legacy prove equally enduring. The precedent he established for the systematic use of terror as an instrument of state policy, the demonstration that psychological warfare can be as effective as physical force, and the proof that cultural achievements offer no protection against sufficiently ruthless enemies all become permanent features of the political landscape he helped create. In the end, Timur represents something more troubling than a simple conqueror. He embodies the dangerous fusion of military genius with artistic sensibility, of systematic brutality with cultural sophistication. His career demonstrates that the capacity for creation and destruction often exists side by side in the same individual, and that the line between civilization and barbarism can be far thinner than comfortable assumptions would suggest. Vlad III, Dracula Impaler Prince. The mists rise from the valleys of Wallachia like the breath of sleeping giants, wreathing the dark pine forests that climb toward the peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. Here, in this land where ancient Roman roads wind through forests older than memory, where the howling of wolves mingles with the distant toll of monastery bells, a castle perches on a rocky outcrop like a bird of prey, surveying its hunting grounds. Poenari Fortress, reached only by a treacherous climb up steps carved from living rock, serves as both refuge and symbol for a prince whose very name has become synonymous with the marriage of political necessity and personal cruelty. The moonlight that filters through the narrow windows of the castle's great hall illuminates a scene that might have emerged from the darkest corners of medieval imagination. Here, Vlad III of Wallachia, known to his contemporaries as Vlad Dracula and to history as Vlad the Impaler, holds court in a chamber that speaks to the precarious nature of power in this borderland between the Christian and Islamic worlds. The walls, built from stones quarried from the surrounding mountains, seem to absorb and hold the shadows, while the flickering light of torches creates patterns that dance like memories of ancient fears. The childhood that shaped this notorious ruler unfolds like a tale designed to explain the emergence of a monster. At the age of 11, young Vlad and his brother Radu are sent as hostages to the court of Sultan Murad II in Adrianople, human guarantees of their father's loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. For 6 years, the future Impaler lives among the enemies of his faith and people, learning their language, studying their customs, and absorbing lessons in statecraft that will later be turned against his teachers with devastating effect. The Ottoman court that serves as Vlad's unwilling school represents one of the most sophisticated political environments of the 15th century. Here, in the heart of the expanding Turkish Empire, the young Wallachian prince witnesses the systematic application of terror as an instrument of state policy. The elaborate protocol surrounding the Sultan's audiences, the careful gradations of reward and punishment that maintain loyalty among diverse populations, and the calculated use of brutality to discourage rebellion all become part of his education in the art of ruling through fear. Yet the most important lesson that Vlad learns during his captivity may be the understanding that survival in a hostile environment requires not merely adaptation but the cultivation of a reputation so fearsome that enemies hesitate to test one's strength. The Ottoman system of government, based on the premise that absolute power requires absolute submission, provides a model that the future prince will adapt to the specific conditions of his homeland. The Wallachia, to which Vlad eventually returns, is a principality caught between competing empires, its very existence dependent on the delicate balance of power between Ottoman Turkey, Hungary, and the emerging threat of Moldavia. The boyars who dominate the country's political life have grown wealthy and powerful through their willingness to serve whichever master offers the greatest immediate advantage, their loyalties shifting with the fortunes of war and the promise of personal advancement. It is into this world of treachery and shifting alliances that Vlad emerges as a claimant to the throne of his ancestors, armed with knowledge gained during his captivity and a determination to impose stability through methods that will shock even an age accustomed to brutality. His understanding of Ottoman administrative methods, combined with his intimate knowledge of the weaknesses and divisions within Wallachian society, provides him with advantages that his rivals cannot match. The domestic campaign that establishes Vlad's authority within Wallachia reveals the systematic nature of his approach to the problem of political control. Rather than simply eliminating individual enemies, he undertakes a comprehensive restructuring of society designed to eliminate the sources of instability that have plagued his principality for generations. The boyar families who have profited from the country's weakness find themselves facing a ruler who understands that lasting power requires the destruction of competing power centers. The Easter massacre that eliminates much of the old nobility demonstrates Vlad's mastery of the psychological dimensions of political terror. By choosing a religious holiday for his action, he transforms what might have been seen as mere political purge into something approaching ritual sacrifice. The survivors carry away not merely fear of Vlad's ruthlessness, but a deeper terror rooted in the violation of sacred time and space. The methods of execution that Vlad employs serve purposes beyond the simple elimination of enemies. The impalement that gives him his grisly epithet represents a calculated choice designed to maximize both the suffering of victims and the psychological impact on observers. The slow death that results from this form of execution, sometimes lasting for hours or even days, provides ample time for contemplation of the consequences of opposing the prince's will. The forest of stakes that greets foreign diplomats approaching Vlad's court represents perhaps the most effective piece of psychological warfare in medieval history. These grisly monuments, populated by the slowly dying bodies of criminals, rebels, and foreign prisoners, serve multiple functions simultaneously. They demonstrate Vlad's power, discourage potential enemies, and provide a constant reminder to his own subjects of the price of disobedience. The psychological impact of these displays extends far beyond their immediate audience. The accounts carried back by surviving diplomats and merchants create a reputation that precedes Vlad's armies and serves as a force multiplier in military campaigns. Enemy commanders find themselves facing not merely the military capabilities of the Wallachian forces, but the accumulated terror of stories that have grown in the telling until they assume mythological proportions. The night raid against the Ottoman camp at Targovishte represents the culmination of Vlad's career as a military commander and demonstrates his ability to translate psychological advantage into tactical success. The Turkish army that Sultan Mehmed II has assembled for the conquest of Wallachia represents overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, and experience. Yet the Wallachian prince understands that conventional resistance would result in certain defeat, while unconventional tactics might achieve what regular warfare could not. The torches that illuminate the Turkish camp on the night of the attack create a scene of confusion that exceeds anything in the Sultan's previous experience of warfare. Vlad's forces, appearing suddenly from the darkness, like demons materialized from the surrounding forests, strike not at military targets but at the psychological foundations of enemy morale. The sight of Wallachian cavalry cutting down sleeping soldiers, of tents burning in the night, and of their own countrymen fleeing in panic creates a terror that transcends immediate military consequences. The confusion that grips the Ottoman forces during the night assault reveals the extent to which Vlad's reputation has preceded him into the enemy camp. Turkish soldiers, waking to the sound of battle cries and the sight of flames, find themselves fighting not merely against identifiable military opponents but against the personification of their darkest fears. The stories they have heard about the Impaler prince transform ordinary combat into something approaching supernatural horror. The aftermath of the night raid demonstrates Vlad's understanding that psychological warfare requires careful management of aftermath as well as initial impact. Rather than simply withdrawing after causing maximum confusion, his forces conduct a systematic program of harassment designed to prevent the enemy from regrouping effectively. The constant threat of renewed attack, combined with the discovery of impaled prisoners left as calling cards, creates a climate of terror that proves more effective than conventional siege warfare. The Turkish withdrawal from Wallachia following the night assault represents a victory achieved primarily through psychological rather than military means. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople and one of the most successful military commanders of his age, finds himself compelled to abandon his campaign not because of military defeat, but because of his inability to maintain morale among forces terrorized by an enemy who seems to embody supernatural malevolence. The diplomatic efforts that follow Vlad's military success reveal another dimension of his strategic thinking. The embassies he sends to Hungarian and Polish courts carry with them not merely requests for military alliance, but carefully crafted propaganda designed to present him as the defender of Christendom against Turkish expansion. The severed heads and other grisly trophies that accompany these missions serve both as proof of his military success and as demonstrations of his usefulness as an ally. The reaction of foreign courts to Vlad's diplomatic overtures reveals the complex nature of his reputation among Christian powers. While they appreciate his effectiveness against the Ottoman threat, they are simultaneously horrified by his methods and uncertain about the reliability of an ally whose brutality seems to exceed all conventional bounds. The correspondence that survives from this period suggests that European diplomats viewed Vlad as a necessary evil rather than a desirable partner. The forest of stakes that greets the returning Ottoman army represents perhaps the most sophisticated piece of psychological warfare in Vlad's repertoire. The sight of thousands of impaled Turkish prisoners, arranged in geometric patterns that stretch for miles across the Wallachian countryside, creates a horror that transcends mere military intimidation. This is terror as art form, brutality elevated to the level of landscape architecture. The accounts of foreign observers who witnessed Oda, Nobunaga Demon King. The summer evening settles over the rice paddies of central Japan, like a silk curtain embroidered with the sound of 10,000 cicadas, their chorus rising and falling in waves that seem to echo the very heartbeat of the land itself. Across the terraced fields that climb toward the forested hills, where ancient shrines mark the boundaries between the world of men and the realm of spirits, the smoke from cooking fires mingles with the lingering heat of the day. It is in this landscape of seeming tranquility that castle beacons begin to flare one by one, their light carrying messages of war and transformation across a country torn by generations of civil conflict. The Japan of the Sengoku period presents a tableau of exquisite beauty and devastating chaos, where the refined aesthetics of court culture exist alongside the brutal realities of endless warfare. This is an age when the central authority of the shogunate has collapsed into a patchwork of competing domains, each ruled by daimyo, who maintain their independence through constant vigilance and the systematic application of military force. Into this world of fragmented loyalties and shifting alliances emerges a figure whose very name will become synonymous with the transformation of ancient traditions through revolutionary innovation. Oda Nobunaga, heir to a minor domain in Owari province, possesses from youth a combination of strategic vision and ruthless pragmatism that sets him apart from his contemporaries. While other young nobles content themselves with traditional forms of warfare and conventional approaches to political advancement, Nobunaga displays an almost supernatural ability to recognize and exploit the possibilities inherent in technological and social change. His court becomes a magnet for innovators, outcasts, and foreign observers who find in him a patron willing to support ideas that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of power. The introduction of firearms to Japanese warfare provides Nobunaga with the opportunity to demonstrate his genius for military innovation. The arquebus, brought to the islands by Portuguese traders, represents more than merely a new weapon. It embodies the possibility of transforming the entire basis of military power from aristocratic skill to technological superiority. While traditional warriors view these crude weapons with disdain, seeing them as threats to the honor and artistry of sword combat, Nobunaga recognizes their revolutionary potential. The Battle of Nagashino stands as perhaps the most devastating demonstration of Nobunaga's tactical revolution. The Takeda cavalry, heir to generations of military tradition and recent victors over numerous enemy forces, charges the Oda Tokugawa positions with the confidence born of centuries of success. These horsemen, masters of mounted archery and close combat, represent the flowering of traditional Japanese military culture, their colorful banners and gleaming armor creating a spectacle that might have emerged from classical poetry. Yet the coordinated volley fire that greets their charge represents something entirely new in Japanese warfare. Nobunaga's ashigaru, common foot soldiers armed with imported firearms, have been trained to function not as individual warriors but as components of a larger military machine. The systematic rotation of firing ranks, the coordination of reload procedures, and the integration of firearm tactics with traditional spear formations create a level of battlefield control that renders traditional cavalry charges obsolete. The slaughter that follows transcends mere military defeat to become a cultural watershed. The flower of Takeda nobility, men whose ancestors had dominated Japanese battlefields for generations, find themselves helpless against enemies they regard as social inferiors armed with weapons they consider dishonorable. The psychological impact of this reversal extends far beyond the immediate battlefield, calling into question fundamental assumptions about the relationship between social status and military effectiveness. The systematic destruction of Mount Hiei represents perhaps the most controversial demonstration of Nobunaga's willingness to challenge traditional sources of authority. The Enryakuji temple complex, seat of the Tendai Buddhist sect and one of the most powerful religious institutions in Japan, had maintained its independence through a combination of spiritual authority and military power. The warrior monks who defend the mountain stronghold represent a synthesis of religious devotion and martial prowess that has intimidated secular authorities for centuries. Nobunaga's assault on this sacred mountain reveals his understanding that lasting political transformation requires the elimination of competing sources of loyalty and authority. The systematic burning of temples, the execution of monks, and the destruction of religious artifacts serve purposes beyond mere military conquest. These actions demonstrate that no institution, regardless of its spiritual significance or historical importance, can stand against sufficient determination and superior technology. The terror that grips the Buddhist establishment following the destruction of Mount Hiei extends far beyond immediate fears for physical safety. The violation of sacred space, the systematic elimination of religious personnel, and the deliberate destruction of centuries of accumulated spiritual and artistic achievement represent an assault on the fundamental assumptions that have governed Japanese society since the introduction of Buddhism to the islands. Yet the complexity of Nobunaga's character becomes apparent in his simultaneous patronage of the arts and cultivation of aesthetic refinement. The same man who orders the burning of ancient temples also sponsors tea masters, supports innovative artists, and collects objects of extraordinary beauty. His tea ceremonies, conducted according to the most sophisticated protocols of aesthetic appreciation, provide a counterpoint to his military campaigns that reveals the multifaceted nature of his personality. The juxtaposition of exquisite aesthetic sensibility with calculated brutality creates a psychological portrait that defies simple categorization. The ruler, who can spend hours contemplating the subtle beauty of a ceramic tea bowl, can also order the systematic execution of entire populations without apparent emotional disturbance. This combination of refinement and ruthlessness proves more unsettling to his contemporaries than simple barbarism would have been. The castle architecture that emerges under Nobunaga's patronage reflects his understanding that psychological impact can be as important as military functionality. The massive stone foundations, innovative defensive features, and imposing aesthetic presence of structures like Azuchi Castle serve to project power across the landscape in ways that transcend immediate military considerations. These buildings become symbols of technological sophistication and unlimited resources, their very existence serving to discourage potential challengers. The foreign observers who find welcome at Nobunaga's court provide external perspectives on the transformation he is accomplishing. Jesuit missionaries, Portuguese traders, and other European visitors describe a ruler whose capabilities and ambitions seem to exceed those of any Western contemporary. Their accounts reveal the extent to which Nobunaga's innovations in military technology, administrative efficiency, and political organization represent genuine advances in the art of governance. The systematic elimination of traditional power centers that characterizes Nobunaga's domestic policy demonstrates his understanding that lasting change requires the destruction of existing authority structures rather than mere military victory. The Iki Leagues, autonomous communities that had maintained independence through collective resistance, find themselves facing an enemy who refuses to accept traditional compromises or acknowledge customary rights. The economic innovations that support Nobunaga's military campaigns reveal another dimension of his strategic thinking. The systematic encouragement of trade, the standardization of currency, and the elimination of traditional barriers to commerce create resources that enable him to maintain military forces far larger and better equipped than his enemies can afford. The wealth generated by commercial expansion becomes a weapon as potent as any technological innovation. The intelligence network that supports Nobunaga's operations demonstrates his understanding that information can be as valuable as military force in achieving political objectives. The systematic collection of data about enemy capabilities, the cultivation of informants within rival domains, and the careful analysis of political relationships enable him to strike at precisely the moments when his enemies are most vulnerable. The psychological warfare that accompanies Nobunaga's military campaigns reveals his recognition that reputation can serve as a force multiplier in achieving strategic objectives. The systematic cultivation of his image as an implacable enemy, the careful management of information about his capabilities, and the deliberate creation of an aura of supernatural power all contribute to victories achieved as much through intimidation as through direct military action. The title Dairakutan, Mao, or Great Demon King, that Nobunaga adopts for himself represents more than mere theatrical posturing. By positioning himself as the enemy of conventional religious and political authority, he creates a psychological framework that justifies the systematic destruction of traditional institutions while simultaneously inspiring fear in potential opponents. The betrayal at Honno-ji that ends Nobunaga's career provides a fitting conclusion to a life defined by the systematic violation of traditional expectations. The trusted retainer who turns against his master, the nighttime assault on what should have been a secure position, and the final scene of the great innovator trapped by flames in a burning temple all contribute to a dramatic conclusion that seems drawn from classical tragedy. Yet the legacy of Nobunaga's innovations proves more durable than his personal rule. The military techniques he pioneered, the administrative systems he developed, and the cultural transformations he initiated provide the foundation for the unification of Japan under his successors. The Demon King who challenged traditional authority becomes, in retrospect, the architect of a new form of centralized government that will endure for centuries. The continuing fascination with Nobunaga's career reveals something important about the relationship between innovation and destruction in processes of historical change. His example demonstrates that transformation of fundamental social and political structures often requires the systematic elimination of existing institutions, and that the capacity for creative innovation can coexist with a willingness to employ methods that exceed conventional moral boundaries. In the end, Oda Nobunaga represents something more complex than a simple revolutionary. He embodies the dangerous fusion of aesthetic refinement with systematic brutality, of technological innovation with cultural destruction. His career serves as a reminder that the architects of historical change often possess personalities that combine vision and ruthlessness in proportions that make them simultaneously admirable and terrifying to those who must live with the consequences of their actions. Shaka, Zulu, Wars of the Iklwa. The spring rains fall like a benediction across the rolling hills of KwaZulu, where the green grass grows thick and sweet between the scattered thorn trees that dot the landscape like ancient sentinels. In this land of endless horizons and hidden valleys, where the morning mist rises from the river courses and the air carries the distant lowing of cattle, a transformation is taking place that will reshape the entire southern tip of Africa. Here, beneath the vast dome of the Southern Cross, young warriors drill barefoot in the mud and rain, their bodies hardened by endless repetition of movements that will soon become the instruments of continental conquest. The man who watches these exercises from beneath a cluster of fever trees possesses the lean build and watchful eyes of someone who has learned survival in the harshest of schools. Shaka, illegitimate son of the Zulu chief Senzanga Kona, carries within himself the accumulated grievances of a youth spent in exile, and the burning ambition of one who has seen power from the outside and learned to hunger for it with an intensity that transcends normal human desire. The military innovations that emerge from his restless mind represent more than tactical improvements. They embody a complete reimagining of what warfare can accomplish when systematically applied to the task of political transformation. The traditional warfare of the Nguni peoples had been characterized by elaborate ritual and limited objectives, where combat served more as a form of competitive display than as an instrument of total conquest. Warriors met on predetermined battlefields, threw their long-shafted assegais from safe distances and generally avoided the kind of close-quarters fighting that might result in significant casualties. This ritualized approach to conflict reflected a social system based on cattle herding and seasonal agriculture, where the preservation of manpower took precedence over territorial expansion. Shaka's revolutionary insight lies in his understanding that this traditional system, however culturally satisfying, is inadequate for the challenges posed by an increasingly competitive political environment. The approach of European colonists from the south, the pressure of population growth, and the need for more extensive grazing lands all demand a more systematic and ruthless approach to the acquisition and retention of power. The military reforms he implements represent nothing less than the industrialization of warfare in a pre-industrial society. The Iklwa, the short stabbing spear that gives this period its name, embodies Shaka's tactical philosophy in physical form. Where traditional warriors had relied on throwing weapons that allowed them to maintain distance from their enemies, the new weapon system demands close-quarters combat that requires courage, discipline, and absolute commitment to victory. The name itself, derived from the sucking sound the blade makes when withdrawn from flesh, reveals the intimate and personal nature of the warfare Shaka envisions. The training regimen that transforms young men into wielders of the Iklwa represents a systematic assault on traditional concepts of military preparation. Where previous generations had learned warfare through participation in hunting expeditions and ceremonial combats, Shaka's warriors undergo a program of conditioning that seems designed to break down individual will and rebuild it in service to collective purpose. The barefoot marches that cover enormous distances at punishing pace, the combat drills that continue until muscle memory replaces conscious thought, and the psychological conditioning that emphasizes absolute obedience to command all, contribute to the creation of a military instrument unlike anything previously seen in southern Africa. The bullhorn formation that becomes the signature of Zulu tactical doctrine demonstrates Shaka's genius for translating hunting techniques into military strategy. The central body of warriors, known as the chest, engages the enemy directly, while the horns execute flanking movements designed to encircle and destroy opposing forces. This tactical system, simple in concept but requiring extraordinary discipline to execute effectively, proves devastatingly successful against enemies trained in traditional methods of combat. The psychological impact of Zulu military innovations extends far beyond their immediate tactical effectiveness. The sight of warriors advancing in perfect formation, their cowhide shields overlapping to create an apparently impenetrable wall, while the rhythm of their war chants echoes across the battlefield, creates a terror that often proves more decisive than actual combat. Enemy forces, accustomed to individualistic fighting styles and ritualized approaches to conflict, find themselves facing what appears to be a single, implacable organism directed by supernatural intelligence. The systematic elimination of traditional military leadership during the early phases of Shaka's campaigns reveals his understanding that lasting change requires the destruction of existing command structures rather than mere military victory. The chiefs and war leaders who had dominated regional politics through their mastery of conventional tactics find themselves facing an enemy who refuses to acknowledge the rules that had previously governed military conduct. The dawn inspections that become a hallmark of Zulu military discipline serve purposes beyond simple readiness verification. These daily ceremonies, conducted with the precision of religious ritual, reinforce the collective identity that transforms individual warriors into components of a larger military machine. The systematic checking of weapons, the verification of shield conditions, and the recitation of regimental histories all contribute to the psychological conditioning that makes possible the extraordinary sacrifices demanded by Shaka's tactical system. The harsh punishments that enforce military discipline reflect Shaka's understanding that the transformation of traditional warrior culture requires methods that shock participants into new patterns of behavior. Warriors who show cowardice in battle, who fail to maintain their equipment properly, or who violate the increasingly complex code of military conduct face consequences that range from public humiliation to death. This systematic application of terror within his own ranks creates a level of unit cohesion and battlefield reliability that proves decisive in conflicts with less disciplined enemies. The regimental system that organizes Zulu society around military age groups represents perhaps Shaka's most far-reaching innovation. Young men, segregated from civilian society during their military service, develop loyalties to their regiments that transcend traditional tribal affiliations. This systematic destruction of local identities in favor of broader Zulu nationalism provides the foundation for the expansion that will transform a minor chiefdom into a regional empire. The military kraals that house these regiments become centers of cultural transformation as well as military training. Here, warriors from different tribal backgrounds learn to function as members of a unified force, their traditional identities subsumed into the larger Zulu identity that Shaka systematically creates. The songs, dances, and ceremonies that emerge from these institutions reflect a new form of cultural synthesis that combines elements from various Nguni traditions while emphasizing themes of military glory and absolute loyalty to the king. The campaign of consolidation that establishes Zulu dominance over the region unfolds with the methodical precision of a military exercise rather than the chaotic violence traditionally associated with tribal warfare. Each conquered chiefdom faces the same choice-complete integration into the Zulu system or total destruction. Those who choose submission find their young men incorporated into Zulu regiments, their cattle absorbed into royal herds, and their traditional leadership replaced by appointees loyal to Shaka. The systematic nature of this consolidation process creates a level of political transformation that exceeds anything previously accomplished in Southern African history. Traditional kinship networks, the foundation of Nguni political organization, give way to a bureaucratic system based on military rank and royal appointment. The result is a centralized state capable of mobilizing resources and coordinating operations on a scale that dwarfs the capabilities of traditional chiefdoms. The psychological warfare that accompanies Zulu military operations demonstrates Shaka's understanding that reputation can serve as a force multiplier in achieving strategic objectives. The systematic cultivation of Zulu military mystique, the careful management of information about their capabilities, and the deliberate creation of an aura of invincibility all contribute to victories achieved as much through intimidation as through direct military action. The treatment of captured enemies reveals the calculated nature of Zulu terror tactics. Warriors who fight bravely, even in defeat, may find themselves offered incorporation into Zulu regiments, while those who show cowardice face public execution designed to reinforce the reputation for military excellence that serves Zulu interests. This systematic application of both mercy and brutality creates a psychological climate where surrender becomes preferable to resistance for all but the most determined enemies. The disruption caused by Zulu expansion, known to historians as the Mfecane or crushing, creates population movements and political upheavals that extend far beyond the immediate sphere of Zulu military operations. Displaced peoples, fleeing the systematic conquest of their homelands, carry with them stories of Zulu military prowess that magnify the kingdom's reputation through the simple process of repetition and embellishment. The European observers who begin to encounter Zulu military power during this period struggle to understand the systematic nature of the political transformation they are witnessing. Their accounts, filtered through assumptions about the nature of African societies and military capabilities, often fail to grasp the sophisticated strategic thinking that underlies Zulu expansion. Yet their descriptions of Zulu military discipline and tactical effectiveness reveal grudging respect for accomplishments that challenge fundamental assumptions about technological determinism in military affairs. The assassination of Shaka by his half-brothers marks the end of an era, but not the end of the military and political innovations he pioneered. The Zulu kingdom that survives his death represents a fundamentally transformed political entity, no longer a traditional African chiefdom, but something approaching a modern, centralized state. The military system he created proves sufficiently robust to survive not only his death but subsequent conflicts with European colonial forces. The mythologization of Shaka that occurs in both African and European historical traditions reveals the extent to which his accomplishments transcended the normal bounds of military and political achievement. To Zulu oral tradition, he becomes the archetypal warrior king, whose exploits provide a template for understanding the relationship between individual genius and collective achievement. To European colonial mythology, he represents the noble savage whose military prowess both threatens and validates assumptions about the inevitability of Western expansion. The continuing debates about Shaka's historical legacy reflect the complex nature of his transformation of Southern African politics. Scholars who emphasize his military innovations and state-building achievements must contend with evidence of the human cost of his conquests, while those who focus on the destructive aspects of Zulu expansion must acknowledge the sophisticated nature of the political and military systems he created. The weapons and tactics that Shaka pioneered continue to influence military thinking long after his death. Their principles recognized by professional officers who study the evolution of combined arms tactics and the integration of psychological warfare with conventional military operations. The transformation of traditional warrior culture into systematic military organization that he accomplished provides a case study in the relationship between technological innovation and social change that remains relevant to contemporary strategic thinking. In the end, Shaka Zulu represents something more complex than a simple military innovatore, embodies the transformation of traditional African societies under the pressure of external threats and internal competition. His legacy serves as a reminder that military genius can emerge from any cultural context, and that the systematic application of human intelligence to the problems of organization and conflict can achieve results that transcend the limitations imposed by technology and resources. Nader Shah, Persian Napoleon. The dust-laden winds that sweep across the caravan routes of eastern Persia carry with them the scent of distant mountains and the whispered promises of merchants who speak of fortunes to be made and empires to be built. Here, in this landscape of endless horizons and scattered oases, where the ancient trade routes that once carried silk and spices between east and west now echo with the sound of armed horsemen, a transformation is taking place that will shake the foundations of 3 continents. The man who rides at the head of these columns of cavalry possesses the weathered features and calculating eyes of one who has learned survival in the harshest of schools. His rise from tribal bandit to imperial conqueror, representing one of history's most remarkable examples of personal ambition transcending social limitations. Nader Khan, who will later crown himself Nader Shah and claim descent from the ancient Sassanid kings, emerges from the chaos of 18th century Persia like a force of nature given human form. The Iran he inherits is a shadow of its former greatness, divided among competing factions, threatened by foreign invaders, and seemingly incapable of defending itself against enemies who smell weakness like predators scenting blood. The Safavid dynasty that had once made Isfahan the wonder of the world has collapsed into internecine warfare, while Afghan invaders occupy the traditional seats of Persian power and Ottoman armies probe the western frontiers. The military genius that transforms this desperate situation into the foundation of a new empire reveals itself first in Nader's understanding that traditional Persian military methods are inadequate for the challenges of the modern world. The heavy cavalry and fortress-based strategies that had served the Safavids adequately in their conflicts with neighboring powers prove useless against enemies who have adapted more quickly to the technological and tactical innovations of the age. What Persia needs, Nader realizes, is not merely military reform but a complete reimagining of the relationship between state power and military capability. The composite tactical system that emerges under Nader's leadership represents a synthesis of military traditions that draws upon the best practices of multiple cultures while transcending the limitations of any single approach. The mobility and individual skill of traditional Persian cavalry are combined with the disciplined firepower of European-style infantry formations, while the siege capabilities learned from Ottoman enemies are integrated with the systematic logistics that enable sustained campaigning across vast distances. The procurement and training of musket-armed infantry demonstrates Nader's understanding that military transformation requires more than simply adopting new technology. It demands the systematic development of new forms of military culture. The soldiers who learn to handle these imported weapons must also learn to function as components of larger tactical formations, their individual skills subordinated to collective purposes, in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about the nature of military valor and personal honor. The artillery that becomes the decisive element in many of Nader's campaigns reveals his genius for recognizing and exploiting technological advantages that his enemies have not yet learned to counter effectively. The cannon that accompany his armies represent more than mere firepower. They embody the marriage of European technical knowledge with Persian strategic vision. Their systematic deployment, demonstrating capabilities that seem to transcend the normal limitations of contemporary military engineering. The campaign that establishes Nader's reputation as a military genius unfolds across the ancient battlefields of Western Persia, where the armies of the Ottoman Empire discover that they face something entirely different from the demoralized Persian forces they had grown accustomed to defeating. The coordination of cavalry charges with artillery bombardments, the systematic use of firearm-equipped infantry to break up enemy formations, and the employment of mobility tactics that keep superior enemy forces constantly off balance all contribute to victories that seem to violate the normal rules of 18th-century warfare. The siege warfare techniques that Nader perfects during his Persian campaigns demonstrate his ability to adapt traditional methods to contemporary requirements while developing innovations that exceed the capabilities of his enemies. The systematic approach to fortress reduction that he employs combines the patient blockade methods of traditional siege warfare with the devastating firepower of modern artillery, creating a tactical system that makes even the strongest fortifications vulnerable to determined assault. The psychological impact of these early victories extends far beyond their immediate military consequences. The Persian forces that had been demoralized by years of defeat and foreign occupation discover that they are capable of triumphing over enemies who had seemed invincible, while opposing commanders find themselves facing an adversary who seems to possess capabilities that transcend normal military limitations. The consolidation of power within Persia that follows these military successes reveals Nader's understanding that lasting achievement requires political as well as military transformation. The traditional power structures that had contributed to Persian weakness, the autonomous provincial governors, the independent tribal chiefs, and the religious authorities who claimed authority separate from royal power rule, find themselves subjected to systematic centralization that transforms Persia from a loose confederation into a unified state. The intelligence network that supports Nader's operations demonstrates his recognition that information can be as valuable as military force in achieving strategic objectives. The systematic collection of data about enemy capabilities, the cultivation of informants within rival courts, and the careful analysis of political relationships that might be exploited all contribute to successes achieved as much through superior knowledge as through superior force. The Delhi campaign represents the culmination of Nader's military career and perhaps the most audacious strategic undertaking of the 18th century. The march across the Hindu Kush into the Indian subcontinent, undertaken with an army that includes not only Persian troops but also contingents from across Central Asia, demonstrates capabilities that exceed those of any contemporary power. The Mughal Empire that faces this invasion, despite its vast resources and long military traditions, proves incapable of mounting effective resistance against an enemy who combines traditional nomadic mobility with modern military technology. The Battle of Karnal, where the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah suffers catastrophic defeat at the hands of Nader's forces, represents a watershed moment in the history of South Asian politics. The systematic destruction of Mughal military power, accomplished through the coordinated employment of cavalry, artillery, and musket-armed infantry, demonstrates the effectiveness of the military reforms that Nader has spent decades perfecting. The sack of Delhi that follows this victory provides a glimpse into both the heights of Nader's achievement and the seeds of his eventual destruction. The wealth that flows into Persian coffers, including the famous Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, represents the accumulated treasures of centuries of Mughal rule. Yet the systematic plundering of the city, conducted with a thoroughness that terrifies even hardened observers, reveals the extent to which Nader's quest for power has consumed his capacity for mercy or restraint. The jeweled elephants that flee through the streets of Delhi during the Persian occupation create one of the most vivid images in the annals of military history. These magnificent creatures, symbols of Mughal power and prestige, become metaphors for the collapse of an entire civilization under the weight of superior military organization and ruthless determination. The civilian terror that accompanies the fall of Delhi serves purposes beyond mere plunder or revenge. The systematic intimidation of the urban population, the public display of captured wealth, and the deliberate humiliation of traditional authority figures all contribute to a psychological campaign designed to discourage future resistance while demonstrating the futility of opposing Persian power. The transformation of Nader's personality during the period of his greatest triumphs reveals the corrupting effects of unlimited power on even the most capable individuals. The strategic genius who had rebuilt Persian military might through careful planning and systematic innovation increasingly gives way to a paranoid tyrant who sees enemies in every shadow and threats in every subordinate's success. The execution of loyal lieutenants that characterizes Nader's later years demonstrates how the very qualities that had enabled his rise's ability to inspire loyalty, his talent for recognizing and developing military talent, and his capacity for strategic thinking become warped by suspicion into instruments of self-destruction. The commanders who had helped him achieve his greatest victories find themselves facing accusations of treason based on evidence that exists primarily in their leaders' increasingly unstable imagination. The growing paranoia that consumes Nader during his final years reflects the internal contradictions of a system based entirely on personal charisma and military success. The empire he has created lacks the institutional foundations that might enable it to survive the deterioration of its founders' judgment, while the military machine that had been his instrument of conquest becomes increasingly unreliable as its commander loses the trust of his own officers. The assassination that ends Nader's career, carried out by his own guards in the intimacy of his tent, provides a fitting conclusion to a life that had been defined by the systematic violation of trust and the erosion of traditional loyalties. The conspirators who strike him down are not foreign enemies or rival claimants to power, but men who had served him faithfully until his paranoia made continued service impossible. The overnight fragmentation of the Persian Empire that follows Nader's death demonstrates the extent to which his achievements had been based on personal capabilities rather than institutional foundations. The territories that had been united through military conquest immediately revert to independence, while the administrative systems that had been created to serve imperial purposes collapse into regional autonomy. The historical legacy of Nader Shah reveals the complex relationship between individual genius and institutional durability in the creation of lasting political change. His military innovations, particularly his synthesis of traditional cavalry tactics with modern firepower, influenced strategic thinking throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Yet his failure to create governmental structures capable of surviving his death ensures that his political achievements prove ephemeral. The comparison with Napoleon that gives this section its title reflects more than mere chronological coincidence. Both men represent the transformation of military genius into imperial ambition. Both achieve spectacular successes through the systematic application of innovative tactics, and both ultimately fall victim to the internal contradictions of systems based on personal authority rather than institutional legitimacy. In the end, Nader Shah represents something more troubling than a simple conqueror. He embodies the potential for individual genius to transcend apparently insuperable obstacles while simultaneously demonstrating the limitations of personal achievement in creating lasting political transformation. His career serves as a reminder that military brilliance and strategic vision, however remarkable, cannot substitute for the patient work of institutional construction that enables empires to outlive their founders. Even Eva, the terrible Tsar of dread. The winter dawn breaks grey and silent over the frozen waters of the Moskva River, where the golden onion domes of the Kremlin churches catch the pale light like candle flames suspended in the crystalline air. Across the snow-covered city, where wooden houses huddle together for warmth, and the smoke from countless chimneys rises straight up in the windless cold, the sound of church bells begins to toll not in celebration, but with the measured cadence of warning. This is Moscow in the 16th century, capital of a realm that stretches from the Baltic forests to the Siberian wastes, where the very mention of the Tsar's name is enough to silence conversation and send men crossing themselves in reflexive protection against forces they can barely comprehend. Ivan Vasilievich, fourth of that name to rule the Russian lands, sits upon a throne that seems carved from the nightmares of his subjects, his court a study in magnificence and terror that reflects the dual nature of his reign. The title, Terrible, that history has attached to his name, carries in the original Russian a meaning that encompasses not merely cruelty, but awesome power, the kind of divine authority that inspires both reverence and horror in equal measure. The young man who inherited the throne as a child, his minority marked by the savage struggles of boyar factions competing for power, has emerged from that crucible transformed into something that transcends ordinary human limitations, a ruler who wields absolute authority with the casual efficiency of a force of nature. The oprichnina that Ivan creates to serve his will represents perhaps history's most systematic attempt to transform political terror into an instrument of governmental policy. These black-robed horsemen, who ride across the Russian countryside with the symbols of hound's head and broom attached to their saddles, embody the Tsar's promise to sniff out treason wherever it might hide and sweep clean the realm of those who threaten royal authority. Their very appearance creates a terror that transcends immediate political considerations, as if the apocalyptic horsemen of biblical prophecy had materialized to ride among the living. The symbolism that surrounds the oprichniki reveals Ivan's genius for psychological manipulation, and his understanding that effective terror requires both substance and theatre. The dog's head represents their role as hunters of treason, while the broom symbolizes their mission to cleanse the realm of corruption. These seemingly crude emblems carry with them associations that reach deep into the collective unconscious of Russian society, tapping into fears and loyalties that transcend rational political calculation. The systematic nature of oprichnina operations demonstrates Ivan's understanding that lasting political transformation requires more than sporadic violence. It demands the creation of institutional structures capable of identifying, isolating, and eliminating threats to royal authority before they can mature into actual resistance. The careful investigation of family connections, the systematic surveillance of suspect individuals, and the methodical confiscation of properties all contribute to a system of control that exceeds anything previously attempted in Russian history. The division of the realm between oprichnina and zemshchina represents Ivan's attempt to create parallel governmental structures that serve different aspects of royal authority. While the traditional boyar councils and administrative apparatus continue to function in the zemshchina, the oprichnina operates according to rules that recognize no authority save the Tsar's personal will. This institutional dualism creates a climate of uncertainty, where no one can be certain which set of rules applies to any given situation. The terror that grips Russian society during the height of oprichnina power extends far beyond those directly targeted for persecution. The systematic unpredictability of the system, the inability of even the most loyal subjects to guarantee their safety, and the constant possibility that denunciation by enemies or rivals might result in destruction all contribute to a social atmosphere where normal human relationships become fraught with danger. The siege of Kazan represents perhaps Ivan's most legitimate military triumph and the achievement that establishes his reputation as a successful war leader. The ancient Tatar stronghold that has dominated the Middle Volga for centuries falls to a combination of innovative siege techniques and systematic psychological warfare that demonstrates the effectiveness of Russian military reforms. The artillery that pounds the city's walls represents more than mere technological superiority. It embodies the transformation of Russia from victim of nomadic raids into a power capable of projecting force across vast distances. The forest warfare that characterizes the Kazan campaign reveals Ivan's understanding of the unique challenges posed by the Russian landscape and his ability to adapt military techniques to local conditions. The systematic clearing of defensive positions, the coordination of riverborne supply lines with overland operations, and the employment of firearms in heavily wooded terrain all demonstrate tactical innovations that will serve Russian armies well in future conflicts. The echo of artillery barrages through the ancient forests of the Volga region creates a sound that resonates far beyond the immediate battlefield. The indigenous peoples who hear these distant thunderclaps understand that they herald the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one that renders traditional defensive strategies obsolete and forces all who would survive to accommodate themselves to Russian power. The opening of the Volga highway that follows the conquest of Kazan provides Russia with access to resources and opportunities that transform the economic foundations of Ivan's realm. The river route that connects Moscow with the Caspian Sea becomes a conduit for trade, exploration, and further expansion that will ultimately carry Russian influence to the Pacific Ocean. The strategic vision that recognizes the importance of this waterway demonstrates Ivan's understanding that military conquest must be followed by systematic exploitation if it is to produce lasting benefits. The Livonian War that consumes much of Ivan's later reign reveals both the heights of his ambition and the limitations of Russian military capabilities when employed beyond the realm's natural sphere of influence. The attempt to gain access to Baltic ports and challenge the commercial dominance of Scandinavian and German powers brings Russia into conflict with enemies who possess technological and organizational advantages that prove difficult to overcome. The prolonged nature of the Livonian conflict demonstrates the extent to which Ivan's strategic vision exceeds his immediate military capabilities. The systematic siege of Baltic fortresses, the complex diplomatic maneuvering required to prevent the formation of anti-Russian coalitions, and the enormous expense of maintaining armies in distant territories all strain Russian resources to their limits while producing few tangible benefits. The domestic consequences of the Livonian War provide the context for some of Ivan's most notorious acts of violence. The need to finance endless military operations, combined with suspicions that boyar opposition is undermining the war effort, creates a climate where economic necessity and political paranoia reinforce each other in deadly synergy. The tragic death of Ivan's eldest son and heir represents perhaps the most poignant demonstration of how the Tsar's terrible temperament ultimately turns inward to destroy what he most values. The scene that unfolds in the royal chambers, the aging Tsar striking down his own son in a moment of uncontrolled rage, becomes emblematic of the self-destructive nature of absolute power, unchecked by any external restraint. The aftermath of this family tragedy reveals the full extent to which Ivan's reign has been shaped by forces beyond rational political calculation. The remorse that consumes him following his son's death, the desperate attempts to undo what cannot be undone, and the growing recognition that his own nature has become his worst enemy, all contribute to a psychological portrait of unprecedented complexity. The cultural afterimage of Ivan's reign persists in Russian society long after his death, embedded in folklore, literature, and popular consciousness in ways that transcend historical fact to become part of the national mythology. The stories told around winter fires, the warnings passed from generation to generation, and the cautionary tales that shape assumptions about the nature of political authority all bear the imprint of his terrifying legacy. The lullabies that Russian mothers sing to their children centuries after Ivan's death still whisper his name as a figure who embodies both protection and threat. The stern father who keeps enemies at bay, but whose anger might consume the innocent, along with the guilty. These cultural artifacts reveal the extent to which his reign has become embedded in the collective unconscious of Russian society. The proverbs and folk wisdom that emerge from Ivan's era reflect a popular understanding of political power that emphasizes its dangerous unpredictability and the necessity of humble submission to forces beyond individual control. The transformation of historical experience into cultural wisdom demonstrates how societies adapt to traumatic events by incorporating their lessons into the basic assumptions that guide daily life. The administrative innovations that survive Ivan's death and continue to influence Russian governmental practices reveal the constructive aspects of his reign that are often overshadowed by his reputation for cruelty. The systematic centralization of authority, the development of bureaucratic procedures that reduce the arbitrary nature of governmental decision-making, and the creation of institutional structures capable of governing vast territories all represent lasting achievements. The legal codes that emerged during Ivan's reign establish precedents for the systematic application of royal authority that will influence Russian jurisprudence for centuries. The tension between customary law and imperial decree, the balance between local autonomy and central control, and the relationship between religious authority and secular power all receive systematic treatment that provides a foundation for future legal development. The military reforms that Ivan implements prove their value in the conflicts that follow his death, enabling his successors to defend Russian territory against foreign invasion, while continuing the expansion that will ultimately create the largest land empire in human history. The service nobility that he creates, the systematic training of military personnel, and the technological innovations that he sponsors all contribute to capabilities that transcend his personal reign. In the end, Ivan IV represents something more complex than a simple tyrant. He embodies the transformation of medieval Russian society into something approaching a modern state, accomplished through methods that reveal both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in the exercise of absolute power. His legacy serves as a permanent reminder that the capacity for constructive achievement and destructive excess often coexist in the same individual, and that the price of political transformation can exceed anything that rational calculation would consider acceptable. Oliver Cromwell, Iron General. The storm clouds gather over the ancient walls of Drogheda, like harbingers of divine judgment, their dark masses pregnant with rain, and the promise of violence that will echo through Irish memory for centuries to come. Here, on the eastern coast of Ireland, where the medieval fortifications that have protected the town for generations stand silhouetted against the September sky, an army unlike any in Irish experience prepares for an assault that will redefine the very nature of warfare in the British Isles. The man who commands these disciplined ranks of Puritan soldiers carries within himself the absolute certainty of one who believes that God's will flows through his sword arm, transforming every military decision into an act of religious devotion. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of the English Commonwealth, stands before the walls of Drogheda with the grim satisfaction of a man who has found his calling in the systematic application of organized violence to the problems of political and religious reform. The island that stretches before his army represents everything that his Puritan soul finds abhorrent: Catholic idolatry, political rebellion against lawful authority, and the stubborn persistence of ancient customs that stand in the way of godly reformation. The campaign that unfolds under his leadership will be conducted not merely as military operation but as crusade, where the rules of conventional warfare give way to the harsher imperatives of divine justice. The breach that Cromwell's artillery opens in Drogheda's walls reveals the technological advantages that parliamentary forces have developed during their long struggle against royal authority. The systematic bombardment that precedes the assault demonstrates capabilities that exceed anything in Irish military experience, while the disciplined advance of the infantry suggests a level of organization and training that transforms ordinary soldiers into instruments of collective will. The storming of the breach unfolds according to the harsh customs of 17th-century siege warfare, where the refusal to surrender when summoned justifies the systematic elimination of the garrison. Yet the methodical nature of the slaughter that follows, the systematic hunting down of soldiers who attempt to hide in churches and private houses, and the calculated brutality directed against civilian populations all suggest something that transcends the normal brutalities of contemporary warfare. The stern orders that govern Cromwell's conduct during the assault reflect his understanding that effective terror requires not mere violence but the systematic application of force according to clearly articulated principles. The execution of the garrison serves not merely as punishment for resistance but as a deliberate message to other Irish strongholds that might contemplate defying parliamentary authority. This calculated use of brutality as an instrument of psychological warfare demonstrates the extent to which Cromwell has learned to subordinate personal emotion to strategic necessity. The religious framework within which Cromwell justifies these actions reveals the dangerous fusion of military efficiency with spiritual certainty that characterizes his approach to warfare. The systematic destruction of Catholic religious artifacts, the deliberate violation of sacred spaces, and the treatment of Irish resistance as rebellion against God's will all contribute to a campaign that treats political and military objectives as inseparable from religious reformation. The new model army that serves as Cromwell's instrument represents perhaps the most significant military innovation in English history. These soldiers, recruited not from traditional social hierarchies but on the basis of religious conviction and military aptitude, embody a new relationship between individual belief and collective action. The steady drum cadence that accompanies their movements across the Irish countryside carries with it the rhythm of inexorable purpose, while their disciplined formations suggest capabilities that transcend those of conventional military forces. The meritocratic principles that govern promotion within the new model army create a military organization that operates according to standards of efficiency rather than social precedents. Officers rise through the ranks based on demonstrated competence and religious orthodoxy rather than birth or wealth, creating a command structure that combines tactical expertise with ideological reliability in ways that prove devastatingly effective against more traditionally organized enemies. The psychological impact of parliamentary military success extends far beyond the immediate battlefield to encompass the broader relationship between social order and military effectiveness. The demonstration that disciplined commoners can defeat aristocratic cavalry, that religious conviction can serve as a substitute for traditional military values, and that systematic organization can overcome individual heroism, all contribute to a revolution in military thinking that will influence European warfare for generations. The hymn singing that characterizes parliamentary forces creates an atmosphere that unnerves their opponents while reinforcing the religious motivation that drives their own efforts. The sound of thousands of voices raised in religious song, drifting across battlefields where more conventional armies might hear only the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded, suggests a level of spiritual unity that transforms military service into religious observance. The dilemmas that face Cromwell as Lord Protector reveal the complex relationship between military success and political legitimacy in a revolutionary society. The man who had proved his effectiveness as a military commander discovers that the qualities that make for successful battlefield leadership, decisiveness, clarity of purpose, and willingness to employ forcido not necessarily translate into the more subtle skills required for effective governance. The balance between Puritan morality and martial severity that Cromwell attempts to maintain creates tensions that reflect the broader contradictions within the Commonwealth system. The religious principles that justify military action against Irish Catholics prove more difficult to apply to the governance of English society, where the need for practical compromise conflicts with the demands of ideological purity. The Irish campaign that establishes Cromwell's reputation as a military commander demonstrates his understanding that effective conquest requires not merely military victory, but the systematic destruction of the social and political structures that might support future resistance. The land confiscations that follow military success, the transportation of populations, and the systematic suppression of Catholic religious practice all contribute to a transformation of Irish society that exceeds anything accomplished through purely military means. The scorched earth tactics that characterize the Irish campaign reflect Cromwell's recognition that traditional methods of pacification are inadequate for dealing with populations whose religious and cultural differences make them inherently resistant to English authority. The systematic destruction of agricultural resources, the deliberate creation of famine conditions, and the forced displacement of civilian populations all serve the strategic objective of eliminating the foundation for future rebellion. The Scottish expedition that follows the Irish campaign reveals Cromwell's ability to adapt his methods to different tactical and political circumstances. The Presbyterian Scots who oppose parliamentary authority present challenges different from those posed by Irish Catholics, requiring a more subtle approach that combines military pressure with political negotiation. The folk memories that preserve the terror of Cromwell's campaigns in both Irish and Scottish tradition reveal the lasting psychological impact of his military methods. The stories passed down through generations of families, the place names that commemorate particular atrocities, and the cultural artifacts that preserve collective trauma all testify to the effectiveness of systematic terror as an instrument of political control. The death of Cromwell in his bed, surrounded by family and advisors rather than on some distant battlefield, provides an ironic conclusion to a career defined by the systematic application of violence to political problems. The man who had spent his life preparing for a martyr's death finds himself dying peacefully in the very palace of the kings he had helped to overthrow. The posthumous execution of Cromwell's corpse, ordered by the restored monarchy as symbolic revenge for regicide, demonstrates the extent to which his reputation had transcended mere military achievement to become part of the ideological struggle that defined 17th-century English politics. The ritual violation of his remains serves not merely as punishment but as an attempt to exercise the revolutionary principles he had embodied. The continuing debates over Cromwell's historical legacy reflect the complex nature of his achievement and the difficulty of separating his military innovations from the political and religious context that produced them. The tactical and organizational reforms he pioneered prove their value in subsequent military conflicts, while the methods he employed in Ireland and Scotland remain controversial centuries after his death. The influence of Cromwell's military reforms on subsequent English and European warfare demonstrates the lasting value of his innovations in military organization and training. The principles of merit-based promotion, systematic drill, and ideological motivation that characterize the new model army become standard features of professional military forces throughout the early modern period. In the end, Oliver Cromwell represents something more complex than a simple military reformer. He embodies the transformation of religious conviction into military effectiveness, the systematic application of ideological principles to the practical problems of warfare and governance. His legacy serves as a reminder that the most effective military innovations often emerge from the intersection of technical innovation with spiritual motivation, and that the price of revolutionary change frequently exceeds anything that can be calculated in purely material terms. Napoleon Bonaparte, Imperial Comet. The morning mist clings to the narrow bridge at Arcole like the breath of history itself, where the sound of distant drums mingles with the gentle lapping of water against stone pylons that have stood since the days of Roman Empire. Here, in this landscape of northern Italy where ancient trade routes wind between fortress cities and fertile plains, the fog of war takes on literal form as artillery smoke drifts across waterways that will soon run red with the blood of empires. It is across this slender span of stone and timber that destiny chooses to reveal itself in the form of a slight young general whose name will soon echo across 3 continents. His genius for warfare matched only by his understanding of how victory on distant battlefields can reshape the political geography of the world. Napoleon Bonaparte, at 27 years of age, possesses the lean intensity of a man who has discovered that his particular talents align perfectly with the opportunities provided by revolutionary chaos. The battlefield that spreads before him represents more than a tactical problem to be solved. It embodies the possibility of transforming military success into political power, of converting the unstable energy of revolutionary France into an instrument capable of remaking European civilization according to his own vision. The charge across the bridge that establishes Napoleon's reputation for personal courage reveals the extent to which he understands that leadership in revolutionary armies requires not merely tactical skill, but the ability to inspire through personal example. The sight of a general seizing a battle flag and leading his men into direct combat creates a psychological impact that transcends immediate military considerations, transforming ordinary soldiers into instruments of his will through the alchemy of shared risk and demonstrated commitment. The core system that emerges from Napoleon's understanding of modern warfare represents perhaps the most significant innovation in military organization since the Roman legions. These self-contained units, each capable of independent operation while remaining part of a larger strategic design, provide a level of tactical flexibility that enables him to achieve concentration of force at the decisive point, while maintaining the dispersed deployment necessary for rapid movement across vast theaters of operation. The speed with which Napoleonic armies move across the European landscape creates a new form of warfare that leaves his enemies constantly struggling to adapt to tactical realities that seem to violate the established principles of military science. The traditional limitations that had governed European warfare, the need for elaborate supply trains, the requirement for seasonal campaigning, and the necessity of maintaining secure communications all give way before the systematic application of organizational genius to the problems of military logistics. The psychological warfare that accompanies Napoleon's military innovations proves as important as any tactical advantage in achieving his remarkable successes. The bulletins that carry news of French victories across Europe serve not merely as factual reports, but as carefully crafted propaganda designed to magnify the psychological impact of military achievements while simultaneously undermining enemy morale and encouraging potential allies. The systematic exaggeration of victory reports that characterizes these bulletins reveals Napoleon's understanding that perception can be as important as reality in determining political outcomes. The accounts of battles that transform tactical successes into strategic triumphs, that minimize French casualties while magnifying enemy losses, and that present temporary advantages as permanent achievements, all contribute to a reputation for invincibility that serves as a force multiplier in subsequent campaigns. The European dread that Napoleon's name inspires among the courts and capitals of the old regime reflects not merely fear of French military capabilities, but recognition that his success represents a fundamental challenge to the assumptions upon which traditional European political order has been based. The demonstration that revolutionary energy can be channeled into military effectiveness, that social mobility can create more competent leadership than aristocratic birth, and that nationalism can serve as a more powerful motivation than dynastic loyalty, all threaten the foundations of monarchical authority throughout the continent. The coalition warfare that emerges in response to Napoleonic expansion demonstrates both the threat that his success poses to traditional European balance of power and the difficulty that conventional military and diplomatic systems face when confronted with revolutionary innovation. The repeated formation and dissolution of anti-French alliances reflects the inability of traditional European diplomacy to develop effective responses to challenges that transcend established categories of international relations. The Battle of Austerlitz represents perhaps the most perfect demonstration of Napoleonic tactical genius, where carefully planned deception combines with flawless execution to achieve a victory that seems to violate the normal relationship between means and ends. The systematic manipulation of enemy perceptions, the careful positioning of forces to create false impressions of weakness, and the precise timing of the decisive assault all contribute to a triumph that establishes Napoleon's reputation as the master of the art of war. The destruction of the combined Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz creates psychological shockwaves that reverberate throughout European society, calling into question fundamental assumptions about military capability and political legitimacy that had governed continental affairs for generations. The site of ancient dynasties brought low by the military genius of a Corsican upstart represents a challenge to established order that transcends mere military defeat to become a crisis of legitimacy. The administrative genius that enables Napoleon to transform military conquest into lasting political achievement reveals another dimension of his extraordinary capabilities. The legal codes, educational systems, and governmental structures that emerge in territories under French control represent not merely the extension of revolutionary principles but the systematic application of rational administration to the problems of governing diverse populations. The Moscow campaign represents both the apotheosis of Napoleonic ambition and the moment when the limitations of his system become apparent. The decision to invade Russia with an army of unprecedented size demonstrates the extent to which his confidence in his own abilities has grown to encompass challenges that exceed even his remarkable capabilities. The Grande Armée that crosses the Niemen River into Russian territory represents the culmination of 2 decades of military innovation and organizational development. This multinational force, drawn from across Napoleonic Europe and unified under French command, embodies the transformation of warfare from dynastic conflict into something approaching total war between competing civilizations. The silent snowflakes that begin to fall on the charred ruins of Moscow create one of history's most powerful images of imperial overreach and the limits of human ambition. The city that burns rather than submit to foreign occupation represents a form of resistance that Napoleon's tactical genius cannot overcome, while the winter that follows demonstrates that even the most perfectly organized military machine remains subject to forces beyond human control. The retreat from Moscow unfolds with a terrible inevitability that transforms the most successful military career in European history into a cautionary tale about the relationship between ambition and reality. The systematic dissolution of the Grande Armée during its withdrawal across the Russian steppes provides a vivid demonstration of how quickly military success can transform into catastrophic failure when strategic objectives exceed available resources. The Kremlin beams that glow crimson in the reflected light of the burning city create a visual metaphor for the destructive potential that lurks within even the most remarkable human achievements. The palace that had housed the Tsars for centuries becomes a symbol of the price that civilizations pay when individual genius overreaches the boundaries of practical possibility. The Waterloo campaign that ends Napoleon's career provides a final demonstration of both his enduring tactical brilliance and the impossibility of overcoming the accumulated weight of continental opposition through military means alone. The battlefield that witnesses his final defeat represents not merely the triumph of Allied arms, but the victory of collective European determination over individual genius. The island reflections that characterize Napoleon's final years on St. Helena reveal the melancholy transformation of dynamic energy into nostalgic contemplation. The man who had reshaped the map of Europe finds himself reduced to dictating memoirs that attempt to justify achievements that speak for themselves, while creating a legend that will outlive the political structures he created. The sound of surf against the lonely cliffs of his prison island provides a counterpoint to the thunder of artillery that had once announced his presence on the battlefields of Europe. This natural rhythm, indifferent to human ambition and achievement, serves as a reminder that even the most remarkable individual accomplishments remain subject to forces that transcend personal will and capability. The comparison between the peaceful sound of waves and the violent thunder of battle that had defined his career creates a meditation on the relationship between action and contemplation, between the restless energy of youth and the resigned wisdom that comes with the recognition of mortality. The Imperial comet that had blazed across European skies finds its final resting place in the endless rhythm of ocean tides. The legacy of Napoleonic warfare extends far beyond his personal achievements to encompass fundamental changes in military organization, tactical thinking, and the relationship between war and politics that continue to influence strategic thought to the present day. The innovations in military administration, the development of staff procedures, and the integration of artillery, cavalry, and infantry into combined arms tactics all become permanent features of modern military organization. In the end, Napoleon Bonaparte represents something more complex than a simple military genius, embodies the transformation of revolutionary energy into imperial ambition, the systematic application of rational organization to the problems of warfare and governance, and the demonstration that individual brilliance can achieve results that seem to transcend normal human limitations while remaining subject to the inexorable constraints of geography, resources, and collective opposition. William T. Sherman's Scorched Earth Stride. The crimson glow rises from the rail yards of Atlanta like a second sunset, where the twisted metal of destroyed locomotives mingles with the charred remains of warehouses that once stored the cotton wealth of the Confederacy. Across the devastated cityscape, where chimneys stand like tombstones marking the graves of burned-out buildings, the smoke drifts in heavy columns that seem to carry with them the accumulated grievances of a nation at war with itself. It is from this scene of systematic destruction that an army unlike any in American military experience prepares to embark upon a march that will redefine the very nature of warfare in the modern age. William Tecumseh Sherman, whose middle name honors the Shawnee chief who had fought against American expansion, possesses the lean, angular features of a man who has spent his life thinking systematically about the relationship between violence and political objectives. The general who stands amid the ruins of Atlanta understands that the war he fights represents something more than a conventional military conflict. It embodies a struggle between competing visions of American civilization that can only be resolved through the complete destruction of one side's ability to continue fighting. The doctrine of total war that Sherman articulates and implements represents a revolution in American strategic thinking that draws its intellectual foundations from his understanding that modern warfare must target not merely enemy armies, but the entire social and economic system that supports military resistance. The systematic destruction of infrastructure, the disruption of agricultural production, and the deliberate creation of refugee populations all serve the strategic objective of convincing Confederate civilians that continued support for their government will result only in further suffering. The careful distinction that Sherman maintains between the destruction of property and the protection of civilian lives reveals his understanding that effective psychological warfare requires moral precision as well as military efficiency. The orders that govern his army's conduct specify that while railroads, factories, and warehouses are legitimate targets for destruction, private homes and civilian persons are to be protected except when military necessity demands otherwise. The march to the sea that follows the burning of Atlanta represents perhaps the most ambitious strategic movement in American military history. The decision to abandon traditional supply lines and live off the wealth of the Georgia countryside demonstrates a level of confidence in both his army's capabilities and the richness of southern agricultural resources that exceeds anything previously attempted by American commanders. The columns that snake across the Georgia landscape create a sight that witnesses will remember for the rest of their lives. 60,000 Union soldiers, marching in parallel formations that stretch across a front 60 miles wide, present a spectacle of organized power that dwarfs anything in previous American military experience. The systematic foraging that accompanies this movement transforms the army into a vast harvesting machine that gathers the agricultural wealth of the region while simultaneously denying it to Confederate forces. The quiet cotton fields that stretch to the horizon seem to hold their breath as the Union columns pass, their silence broken only by the distant sound of fife music and the creaking of wagon wheels. This peaceful landscape, which has known only the gentle rhythms of agricultural life, now witnesses the transformation of war from a conflict between professional armies into something that touches every aspect of civilian existence. The systematic destruction of railroad infrastructure that accompanies Sherman's advance reveals his understanding that modern warfare must target the technological systems that enable enemy resistance. The twisted rails that his soldiers leave behind, heated in bonfires of railroad ties and wrapped around telegraph poles in patterns that Confederate engineers call Sherman's neckties, represent more than mere tactical vandalism. They embody the systematic elimination of the transportation network that connects Confederate military forces with their sources of supply and reinforcement. The psychological leaflets that precede Sherman's columns serve purposes beyond simple propaganda. They represent a systematic effort to undermine Confederate civilian morale while offering alternatives to continued resistance. The printed broadsides that promise protection to those who abandon support for the Confederate cause, combined with detailed descriptions of the fate awaiting those who persist in opposition, create a climate where surrender becomes a rational choice for civilian populations. The terror that grips Confederate civilians at the approach of Sherman's army reflects not merely fear of immediate violence, but recognition that his march represents the collapse of fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare and the security of civilian populations. The demonstration that organized military forces can move freely across Confederate territory, destroying infrastructure and gathering supplies at will, calls into question the ability of Confederate authorities to protect their own people. The disciplined nature of Union foraging operations reveals the extent to which Sherman has succeeded in maintaining military order while conducting what amounts to systematic economic warfare against Confederate society. The careful regulation of food collection, the prohibition against unnecessary destruction, and the systematic protection of civilian persons all demonstrate that the devastation his army creates results from strategic calculation rather than undisciplined revenge. The mills and manufactories that fall to Sherman's advance represent more than military targets. They embody the industrial capacity that enables Confederate resistance. The systematic destruction of these facilities, accomplished through methods that range from controlled demolition to simple burning, serves the strategic objective of eliminating the South's ability to produce the weapons and equipment necessary for continued warfare. The refugee columns that flee before Sherman's advance create one of the most poignant images of the Civil War era. These streams of displaced civilians, carrying their possessions in improvised bundles and driving livestock before them, represent the human cost of strategic warfare, while simultaneously serving Sherman's objective of disrupting Confederate social and economic systems. The liberation of Union prisoners of war that occurs during Sherman's march provides emotional validation for the harsh methods he employs. The sight of skeletal figures emerging from Confederate prison camps serves as a powerful reminder of the stakes involved in the conflict, while reinforcing the moral framework that justifies total war against a society that permits such treatment of captured enemies. The arrival at Savannah that completes Sherman's march to the sea represents more than a successful military operation. It embodies the demonstration that Confederate territory offers no sanctuary from Union military power. The telegram that Sherman sends to President Lincoln, offering him the city of Savannah as a Christmas present, captures both the success of the operation and the psychological impact of Union forces appearing on the Atlantic coast after marching across the heart of Confederate territory. The turn northward that begins Sherman's Carolina campaign represents an escalation of the psychological warfare that had characterized his Georgia operations. The march through South Carolina, the state that many Northerners consider the birthplace of secession, takes on a punitive character that exceeds even the destruction wrought in Georgia. The burning of Columbia creates one of the most controversial episodes of Sherman's career, where the systematic destruction of a state capital serves both military and symbolic purposes. The flames that consume the South Carolina State House represent not merely the elimination of Confederate governmental facilities, but the symbolic demonstration that secession cannot protect its supporters from the consequences of their political choices. The complex stance that Sherman adopts toward post-war Reconstruction reveals the contradictions inherent in his approach to warfare and politics. The general who had been willing to employ the harshest methods against Confederate resistance shows surprising moderation in his attitude toward defeated enemies, recognizing that lasting peace requires reconciliation as well as victory. The march to the sea becomes embedded in American military doctrine as a demonstration of how strategic mobility and systematic destruction can achieve political objectives that conventional battlefield victories cannot accomplish. The principles that Sherman pioneers, the targeting of enemy economic systems, the use of movement as a weapon, and the integration of psychological warfare with military Operation Soul become standard features of modern strategic thinking. The debates that continue to surround Sherman's methods reflect the enduring tension between military effectiveness and moral constraints that characterizes warfare in democratic societies. The question of whether his systematic destruction of Southern infrastructure represented legitimate military necessity or excessive punishment for political rebellion remains a subject of historical controversy that illuminates broad questions about the ethics of total war. In the end, William Tecumseh Sherman represents something more complex than a simple military innovator. He embodies the transformation of American warfare from limited conflict between professional armies into total war between competing societies, where victory requires not merely battlefield success, but the systematic destruction of the enemy's ability and will to continue fighting. His legacy serves as a reminder that the most effective military methods often challenge comfortable assumptions about the relationship between war and society, and that the price of decisive victory may exceed anything that purely military calculations would consider necessary. Heinz Guderian Blitzkrieg's Lash. The pre-dawn darkness settles over the Polish countryside like a blanket woven from silence and anticipation, where the summer warmth of early September still lingers in the air that will soon carry the thunder of a military revolution. Across the meadows and grain fields that stretch toward the horizon, where morning fog rises from hidden streams and the first light of dawn catches on the metal of waiting machines, an army unlike any in military history prepares to demonstrate that the nature of warfare itself has been transformed by the marriage of technology and tactical innovation. The engines that idle in the Polish darkness belong to a new generation of fighting vehicles that embody revolutionary concepts about the relationship between mobility, firepower, and shock action. These panzers, their steel flanks painted in the field grey of the Wehrmacht, represent more than mere technological advancement. They are the physical manifestation of tactical theories that will reshape not only the conduct of warfare, but the entire political geography of the 20th century. Heinz Guderian, the architect of this mechanical revolution, possesses the intense focus of a man who has spent decades thinking systematically about the possibilities inherent in technological change. The general who watches his armored formations prepare for their first test understands that he is about to demonstrate principles that transcend immediate tactical consideration. Success or failure will determine whether the static warfare that had dominated military thinking since the Western Front can be replaced by something that returns mobility and decision to the art of war. The theoretical foundations that underlie Guderian's tactical innovations draw their inspiration from the brutal lessons of the First World War, where the marriage of defensive firepower with field fortification had created a form of warfare that seemed to negate the possibility of decisive victory. The tank formations that now await his orders represent an attempt to restore the offensive capabilities that modern weapons had seemingly eliminated, to break through the tactical stalemate that had consumed millions of lives without producing strategic resolution. The radio communications that coordinate these armored formations represent perhaps the most significant innovation in military organization since the development of the telegraph. The ability to maintain constant contact between widely dispersed units, to coordinate complex movements in real time, and to adapt tactical plans to changing battlefield conditions all contribute to capabilities that exceed anything previously attempted in military operations. The sickle-cut plan that guides the German offensive through France demonstrates Guderian's understanding that modern warfare requires not merely tactical innovation but strategic thinking that can exploit the psychological and political vulnerabilities of enemy societies. The decision to attack through the Ardennes forest, considered impassable by French military planners, represents more than mere tactical surprise. It embodies a revolutionary approach to strategy that seeks to win wars through the systematic destruction of enemy decision-making capabilities, rather than the gradual attrition of military forces. The crossing of the Meuse River that opens the French campaign reveals the extent to which German tactical innovations have solved problems that had seemed insoluble during the previous war. The coordination of dive bombers with armored spearheads, the systematic suppression of enemy artillery through air attack, and the rapid construction of pontoon bridges under fire all demonstrate capabilities that transform river barriers from impassable obstacles into temporary delays. The speed with which German armored columns penetrate French defensive positions creates a form of warfare that leaves defending commanders struggling to maintain any coherent picture of battlefield developments. The traditional military virtues of careful planning and systematic coordination become liabilities when facing an enemy whose movements seem to violate the established principles of tactical possibility. The psychological impact of armored warfare extends far beyond its immediate military effectiveness to encompass the broader relationship between technological capability and political will. The sight of tank columns moving freely through countryside that had been considered secure creates a terror that transcends rational military calculation, calling into question fundamental assumptions about the nature of defense and the security of civilian populations. The breakdown of French command and control that follows the German breakthrough demonstrates how tactical innovation can achieve strategic effects that exceed anything that could be accomplished through conventional military means. The inability of French headquarters to maintain contact with forward units, the collapse of communication systems under the pressure of rapid German advances, and the systematic disruption of supply lines all contribute to a form of organizational paralysis that proves more decisive than any battlefield defeat. The overwhelmed reports that flood back from French units attempting to cope with German tactical innovations reveal the extent to which traditional military thinking had failed to anticipate the possibilities inherent in technological change. The accounts of tank formations appearing where no tanks should be able to operate, of air attacks coordinated with ground operations in ways that seemed impossible, and of German forces moving at speeds that violated all previous assumptions about the tempo of military operations, all contribute to a climate of confusion that proves as valuable as any tactical advantage. The constant radio chatter that enables German commanders to maintain control over rapidly moving operations represents a revolution in military command that transforms the very nature of generalship. The ability to issue orders in real time, to coordinate complex movements across vast distances, and to adapt plans to changing circumstances all enable a form of warfare that demands new forms of military leadership. The fuel and ammunition that sustain German armored operations require logistical innovations that parallel the tactical developments that make blitzkrieg possible. The systematic pre-positioning of supply dumps, the development of mobile maintenance facilities, and the coordination of air transport with ground operations all contribute to capabilities that enable sustained high-tempo operations across vast distances. The inner conflicts that develop between Guderian and his superiors reveal the tension between tactical innovation and strategic orthodoxy that characterizes military organizations attempting to adapt to technological change. The resistance that his ideas encounter from traditional military thinkers reflects broader difficulties that established institutions face when confronted with revolutionary possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions. The arguments with Hitler that mark Guderian's later career demonstrate the dangerous relationship between military innovation and political authority in totalitarian systems. The tactical genius who had revolutionized warfare finds himself increasingly at odds with political leadership that views military operations primarily as instruments of ideological rather than strategic objectives. The dread that German tactical success inspires among Allied populations extends far beyond immediate military considerations to encompass broader fears about the relationship between technological advancement and human agency. The demonstration that systematic application of mechanical principles to military problems can achieve results that seem to transcend normal human limitations creates anxieties that persist long after the immediate military threat has been contained. The post-war writings that preserve Guderian's tactical insights for future generations of military leaders represent both a contribution to professional military education and a warning about the relationship between technological capability and strategic wisdom. The principles he articulates about the employment of armored forces, the coordination of combined arms operations, and the integration of air and ground capabilities all become standard features of modern military doctrine. The influence of Guderian's innovations on subsequent military development demonstrates the lasting value of his contribution to the art of war, while simultaneously revealing the limitations of purely tactical solutions to strategic problems. The armies that study his methods learn to combine mobility with firepower in ways that transform the conduct of conventional warfare, yet they also discover that tactical excellence cannot substitute for strategic wisdom or political judgment. The continuing relevance of blitzkrieg principles in contemporary military thinking reflects both the enduring value of Guderian's insights and the persistence of the technological and organizational challenges that his innovations were designed to address. The integration of precision weapons with rapid movement, the coordination of air and ground operations, and the exploitation of information technology to achieve tactical surprise all represent developments of principles that he pioneered in the Polish countryside more than 80 years ago. In the end, Heinz Guderian represents something more complex than a simple tactical innovator. He embodies the transformation of military thinking through the systematic application of technological possibilities to strategic problems, while simultaneously demonstrating the dangers that result when tactical brilliance operates in service of flawed strategic objectives. His legacy serves as a reminder that military innovation, however remarkable, remains subject to the larger political and moral contexts that determine whether technological capability serves constructive or destructive purposes.